All right, I think we are about time to begin our lecture today. All right, first of all, it is my pleasure to be here to host a talk. Before I introduce our speaker today, I will say a few words about the lecture series, the Sino-ASEAN Infrastructure Nexus, Media, Cultural, Geopolitics, which is an online lecture series organized by myself and a couple of teachers here at the National Yangming Jiao Tong University. And today's talk will be the very first talk in the three lecturer series. So you can see probably from the promo that we have today's speaker, Zhuang Wubin, photographer, artist, curator, photography researcher with us. Later on, just a little promo for later events. We have Songjin Lee, who is a cinema and film researcher, also based in Singapore, who is also director of Asian Media Lab, Asian Cinema Lab in Nanyang Technological University. And then we also have Ian Chong, who is an IR, International Relations Scholar, who is also a friend, who will be talking next December 10th about the ASEAN's relation with China. Okay, so this a few words about this lecture series is the idea behind this lecture series is sort of like a tie-in with the recent attention and kind of like a sensitive and intensive attention paid the recent development of what's going on between the Sino-Foreign world and Sino-Foreign world meaning China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, part of Singapore, Malaysia, and the broader ASEAN countries. What's going on right now with the intervention of the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy going on with the U.S. between U.S. and China. Also, with this, before the pandemic, China had the Belt and Road Initiative extending not only to westward to the European continent, but also through Indochina and Malaysia, and which caused a lot of issues, collaboration, promises, and also lots of entangled issues locally and internationally. And the reason we put this lecture series together is that while all this going on, what these happenings, this event going on right now, seem to have more to do with the hard infrastructure of geopolitics. But it seems that that definition or that understanding of infrastructure as we know it from the recent event seems to be a bit more limited in terms of a social and cultural phenomenon. So, and we want to use this lecture series sort of to ask questions as to, can we also, other than talking about geopolitics of hard infrastructure of international relation, can we also talk about the form, the media form, the cultural form, and the social form that was sort of accompanying the infrastructure that we are seeing nowadays? And the tentative answer or tentative idea about this lecture series is that we want to bring these issues about infrastructure thinking, about recent geopolitics back to a more historically specific scenario, even before what we are seeing now, to the Cold War era, to the early colonial era. And then we realize that, well, not only can we see bridges or military infrastructure as infrastructure, the movement of images, the movement of goods, the movement of material objects, or including photography, including cinema, could be part of the so-called human social infrastructure that the current event are built upon, or took place. So we you want to use this lecture series as kind of give it historical layers to this idea of the ASEAN Sinophone world infrastructure as a kind of through a kind of historical lens, but also taking the issues from the political economy dimension, political economic dimension to the issues, to the artistic and aesthetic dimension. And I think that's why there's this lecture series. And so today I want to introduce our first speaker of this lecture series, Zhuang Wubin. It's really my pleasure to meet Dr. Zhuang again, Wubin again. We first met in one of the events, hosted by Taiwan's newly established National Center of Photography and Images, NPCI, who is a whole new government-sponsored center to promote the understanding of photography as cultural, as media technology, and as a social heritage, as a social issues. And so, in one of the conferences, Wubin and I had the pleasure to host a panel who Wubin participated in with other filmmakers and photographers. But I realized while I was hosting that roundtable, I think there was a roundtable, and I realized that Wubin has so much astonishingly huge historical archive that I probably have never seen such rich archive. My microphone. Okay. Anyway, so during that roundtable, I realized that the allotted time of 15 minutes given by the National Center of Photography was just too short for such impressive amount of historical archive, of photograph, of documents, of print journals. All those photographic ephemera was just so rich for a 15 minutes talk allotted to Wubin. And I decided that, okay, I really need to invite him again back to Taiwan and give enough time for his sharing. And so I think without no further ado, I want to give the floor, the Zoom, to our speaker today, Dr. Zhuang Wubin. And also, let's also remind everyone here in the Zoom that you are welcome to turn on your. I know many here of you are our students here, grad students here, and some of you are not. But you're welcome to turn on the visuals. And also, we have a chat box. If you have questions during the talk, we will have a break around like 45, 44 minutes. But before that, if you have questions that cannot be held for longer, please leave your message and question in the chat box. And okay, yeah. Anyway, so this is for the logistics, and for the Chinese listener, 听中文的朋友或同学或同事们，右下角会有一个中文的有一个 interpretation 的按钮，然后你按了之后可以选择中文，那我们会有中文的口译也可以。那如果你不需要用口译，就是 stay with the English channel 就可以了。Okay, so without no further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Zhuang Wubin, and thank you again, Wubin, for coming and joining us in Taiwan. And it's good to see you again. Across the South China Sea.
Thanks, Lawrence and Chong-Yi for inviting me. Okay, so I'm very happy to be speaking to the audience. Actually, I heard a lot about your program, so unfortunately, I'm unable to come to Taiwan. Hopefully, there will be a time in future that we can meet in person. So actually, I prepared about 150 something slides. So I think so I have to be quite fast. But I'm told that in the interest of interpretation, I'm supposed to be a little bit slower.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, so I hope I can try to finish everything. I'll roughly speak for an hour and a half. Sometime in between, at about 40 to 45 minutes, I will probably call for a break, and we can take a break for 3 to 5 minutes, and I'll come back and finish the second half of the presentation. So without further ado, let me start and share screen. You can see my presentation, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so today my presentation is titled Salon Photography, Chineseness and the Making of National Cultures in Southeast Asia. If you notice, I actually grayed out Chineseness because just to indicate that it's actually a factor that concerns my subject matter, but it's not a factor that is always present. It's something like a specter. Sometimes you actually see it, sometimes you don't actually see it. So it's kind of like fleeting in and out, like a ghost. So today this is roughly what I'm going to talk about in terms of the, how the presentation or the sharing would unfold. I will just very, very briefly set out the kind of conceptual background. So it's a very brief conceptual background, looking at photographs, praxis of photography, and Chineseness. Then I'm just going to give a very brief introduction for people who might not understand what is salon photography. And I thought that because maybe some of our audiences are not so involved in photography, I thought that the best way might be to tell stories. So I think I will tell the stories of, unfortunately, 3 old male photographers. One is Guo Shanghui, one is KF Wong, and one is Raymond. And I will use their life experiences and their life stories to kind of like intercompare and interreference, and then to make some comments in relation to the topic itself. And hopefully, point 6 and 7, I would have the time to actually close the presentation, which is basically at point 6 and 7, I'm trying to kind of like pull out some of the things that I've mentioned in relation to the examples, to consolidate them and actually to give a kind of like closure to the presentation. Now, so this is a kind of like a visual map that I often like to use to discuss photography, or what I call the praxis of photography. A lot of times, I think in art history or in photography history, we tend to focus exclusively on the photographer. But for me, the praxis of photography actually involves at least 3 different parties who overlap in terms of their roles and function. So you have, of course, traditionally the photographer. You have the person who is being photographed. I call this person the photographed person. And the relationship between these 2 persons will always interchange, especially now with the mobile phone. So the photographer will sometimes become the photographed person, and the photographed person will sometimes take out the phone and photograph the photographer. So their status is always in flux. And then there's a very, very important group of people called the users of photography. And they also overlap with the photographed persons and the photographer. So this is a really big group of people that we often don't talk about in relation to, let's say, art history or photo history. For today's presentation, actually, I'm also not going to talk too much about the users of photography. I will focus primarily on the photographer, but also on patronage. Also on patronage. So there is this group of people called the patrons, who sometimes can be the photographed person, sometimes can also be a photographer who is also a patron, who is sometimes also a user of photography. So they sit somewhere in between here. Now, I want to just say that I call this encounter between the photographed person and the photographer, what I call the photographic encounter. And it is important to note that while there may be an encounter, sometimes there's no photographs being made. And this sounds a bit odd, right? It means to say that when the photographer meets the photographed person, it is not always that photograph is being produced. Sometimes they are just only spending time to get to know each other before the photograph is being made. Sometimes even when the photograph is being made, it will be rejected and deleted. So the photographic encounter is a kind of experience between the photographed person and the photographer. However, the photograph is not the only outcome of the photographic encounter. Okay, Also, very commonly, when I describe this praxis of photography, I like to bring in the concepts of embodiment and the idea of desires. I won't go into too much detail here, but just to say that embodiment calls our attention to the idea of experience. So photography is not just the making of a photograph. Photography is an experience. The praxis of photography is an experience. And then we are also interested in the intersection of individual and institutional desires. So if we are analyzing photography, at least in my work, there are two dimensions of analysis here. So you have the praxis of photography, which we talk about, and occasionally you will produce the photograph. So there are two layers of analysis here. In my work, I don't focus exclusively on the photograph. In fact, a lot of times I focus on the praxis of photography. And what I want to say here as well is this other idea, which is really important for our discussion, and also to echo Lauren's introduction just now, that in my sense of understanding photography, photography works and really takes effect through circulations. And this idea of circulation is really one of the reasons why photography is so appealing to national, colonial, imperial elites in their political projects. But what do I mean by circulations? So photography as circulations in my work, or at least in my interest, refers to the circulations of visual ideas and references. It refers to the circulations of technology, be it camera, printing, publishing, media technology, circulation of photographic chemicals. Of course, it refers to the circulations and migration of people. And you talk about the colonialist, the photographers, the businessman, the refugee, the opportunist. They move across borders, and then sometimes they make a name for themselves. We are also talking about the material circulation of, let's say, postcards, photographs, photo books, periodicals, and zines. And so you can see that inevitably, right, these circulations of photographs and praxis of photography, they intersect all the political affinities throughout the 20th century. And these circulations co-produce the imaginaries of the nation, the region, and the world. Now, I use Chineseness, as I said, as I try to intimate right at the start, in a very, very open-ended way. It's almost like a specter. I use it almost like I use it both as an analytical category, but also I use it to refer to a kind of experience, a corporal experience, both of which relating to the performative of being Chinese. But I also use it to kind of signify the looming presence of China, I mean, regardless of how we might define China in Southeast Asia. So this is really the kind of like very brief groundwork that I would lay for the interest of this presentation. Now I'm just going to talk very quickly about what I mean by salon photography. Basically, salon photography was the moment when photography became art. Now, the more common term that you would see in art history would be pictorialism or amateur photography. It is sometimes translated in Chinese as 画意摄影, but I prefer the term salon photography or salon 摄影 for one very important reason. Salon photography survived for a very, very, very long time in Southeast Asia, and probably you could argue in East Asia, partly because of a large group of ethnic Chinese practitioners. And the term that they often like to use was salon 摄影. So I actually, in my work, I prefer to use this term salon photography to mark the kind of specter of Chineseness that hides behind pictorialism. Now, in the Philippines, of course, the more common term is camera club aesthetics. Of course, in all the vernacular languages in Southeast Asia, salon photography or pictorialism was translated or is translated into different terms. I will not go into the details. But if we talk about pictorialism from the Eurocentric perspective, right, it was really the first international movement, and its major period of influence was 1880s to World War I. It was largely centered in Western Europe and America, and its intention was really to elevate the status of photography as art. So it's not a singular movement. So there are people who, agree and disagree amongst its practitioners on what would be the art of photography. So without going into all these details, I would just say that some of its lasting legacy would be that pictorialism brought a more stringent standard in terms of making exhibitions. You know, the idea of limited edition prints also originated from pictorialism. Now, I think that's a good enough and brief introduction. I would just very quickly just show two, what we would nowadays call, you know, the Asian masters of salon photography. I think for people who are in Taiwan and more familiar with the history of Taiwanese photography, you will know this gentleman, Lang Jingsan, a very iconic figure for salon photography and I would say Chinese photography as well. So these are some of his work. And I think this work is really important where that we must understand that salon photography, in order to promote photography as art, there was a group of people within salon photography that wanted to kind of like use photography to mimic painting, to achieve, you know, the framework, the aesthetic framework of painting. So there is in salon photography a strong influence or strong emphasis on aesthetics, composition, your technical know-how of the camera, and creating an atmospheric image. So this image is actually made in 1963. So this is not a Photoshop image. This is completely created in the dark room using probably 3 different negatives. So there is maybe 1 negative of the mountain, 1 negative of the background of this village, and then probably 1 negative of this, you know, wallows in the front. So probably 3 or even maybe 4 negatives. And it's a composite image. And you can see the intention is really quite clear. In order for photography to become art, at least to Lang, right? Or at least to Lang Jingsan, it was to try to mimic, you know, Chinese ink painting. Then you have another very famous photographer that I think some of you might know because I think he just passed away recently as well and got a few, was like the subject of greater focus actually in the later part of his life. His name is He Fan actually, or Fan Ho. But he also made his name through salon photography. So I will just show some of the work and I'll move on. I will talk a little bit about the praxis of salon photography. Now, one of the things that salon photographers or salon photography would do would be to organize competitions, which typically then lead to the opportunity of doing exhibitions. You must understand that doing exhibitions in Southeast Asia, or actually I think in East Asia as well, 100 years ago, 50 years ago was not so easy. So one of the easiest way would be to submit to a salon photography contest and then to be selected and then to be exhibited. And that's how you make your name as a salon photographer. So this is an example from Siam in 1905 during the Winter Fair of Wat Ban in Bangkok, right? So there was a contest held. And then, of course, the people from the palace, including Rama V, King Chulalongkorn, and his consort, like Ed Bunak, they participated alongside with the Thai public, you know. So they gave out like 5 gold medals, 30 silver medals, and, you know, a number of bronze medals. And it was awarded through popular vote. So no surprise, the king won in all 3 categories. So this is the submission from King Chulalongkorn. So you can see again, the emphasis on atmosphere, beauty, and aesthetics. You know, so this is another submission from King Chulalongkorn. So you can see by participating in this exhibition, in a way, the king shows that he was a practitioner or at least somebody who was interested in salon photography or pictorialism, but also he was trying to lend patronage to this kind of art form. Now, the other thing that shapes salon photography is really that many of its followers, they would form what we would call camera clubs or photo societies. So you can see that in Western Europe and the USA, right, the peak period for pictorialism was 1880s to 1910s. After that, basically salon photography waned, and then it was the onset of what we could call modernist photography in Western Europe and the States and the USA. But in Southeast Asia and East Asia, you can see a longevity of salon photography just by looking at the number of clubs that was formed from that period of time. And you will notice that there is 2 major periods of rapid forming of these photo societies and amateur camera clubs. So you can see 1920s, so the late colonial, or you could say like the decade 1 or 2 decades before the war or the late colonial period for some, there was a massive flourishing of photo societies, camera clubs in Southeast Asia and East Asia. And then in the 50s and 60s, you see another sprouting of camera clubs, photo societies in Southeast Asia and East Asia. And that was, of course, the period of decolonization and Cold War. Now, what do salon photographers do on a weekly basis? So if they are members of a club, what typically happens would be that they would go out on a weekend. Usually it's a weekend, Sunday, where people are not working, and then they would go out as a group and they would go out and take photographs. So this is a photo outing in Singapore, 1962. And even now, 2017, this is another photo outing where Malaysian photographers from the Sarawak Photo Art Society would go and photograph an indigenous person in the longhouse in Sarawak. And it's really interesting because in Indonesia, this kind of activity is called photo hunting. So you can see the specter of hunting. And the Chinese term actually is called, and the term that is often used in Chinese publication is called Lie Yin. So you also see the specter of hunting, right? And it will be interesting to find out actually which term predates the other. My suspicion is that the Chinese term came first before the term photo hunting was used in Indonesia. So this is what they would typically do. And then they would submit, they would produce the images. Usually there will be an informer teacher who would be an award-winning salon photographer, somebody who submitted to the exhibitions and competitions and won a lot of awards. They would become the master, and they would be the person that's teaching all these photographers what to do, how to make a better photograph. Now, a very typical way of thinking about salon photography today in Southeast Asia and also in other parts of the world is to think of salon photography either as conservative, because for whatever reason that might be, so some people think that salon photography is, okay, just conservative. Whereas some people would think that salon photography is something which they would call photographic modernism. And this, so in other words, a certain kind of progressive avant-garde, or at least an aesthetic avant-garde. And this later view is more common actually in Singapore and to some extent in Thailand, but less common in other places in Southeast Asia. So this later idea that salon photography would be seen as kind of like a photographic modernism is kind of more common in Singapore, Thailand, and maybe to some extent Vietnam, but not so much in other places. And in Singapore case, at least it's quite clear because in order to invent a history of photographic art in Singapore, so there is of course this very strong interest to find what was the example of photographic art in the 50s. And the only kind of image that the curators could turn to would be salon photography. So that's the reason why they would need to reinvent salon photography as some kind of photographic modernism. Not to say that I disagree with such a perspective. I think there is validity in such a perspective, but we have to tread cautiously because I think this is a very simplistic binary. So to think of salon photography as conservative or to think of salon photography as some kind of photographic modernism, this kind of dualism or binary is kind of reductive and simplistic. So it also quite nicely maps into another binary that I often come across in Southeast Asia, which is this idea that nation building and nationalism is conservative versus the idea that nationalism, nation building is progressive. And again, I think it's hopefully through the three examples of the three photographers that I'm going to talk about, you will see that the binary doesn't really hold in terms of describing their experiences. So what I'm going to now try to do is to try to flesh out or relive the experiences of these three photographers to understand the praxis of photography for these three individuals. Now, the first person that I'm going to talk about is Guo Shanghui. So I was actually commissioned in 2017 to make a book for him. So this is the book that was being published in 2018. So this is a little bit of a biographical detail. The thing that is, I'll just point out some of the more interesting things. Guo Shanghui was actually born in South Vietnam. And he migrated to Singapore when he was, he moved to Singapore when he was 24 years old to become a teacher. And then he learned photography when he was in the 1950s. And then very quickly, he was already involved in the Camera Club. So you can see 1953, he was involved in the exhibition subcommittee of the first Pan-Malayan photographic exhibition, which is organized by the Singapore Camera Club. So this is the late colonial period for Singapore. And this Singapore Camera Club, of course, is under the group of cultural and art societies under the purview of the British colonial authorities. And in 53, they organized this first Pan-Malayan exhibition. And so he was in the committee. I think he participated as well, if I remember correctly. 1957, he became an associate of the Royal Photographic Society of the UK, or what we call RPS. And RPS, in many ways, is the golden standard of salon photography. Everybody during that period of time, if you're interested in the photographic arts or salon photography, you would try to get and become an associate of RPS. It used to be that if you became an RPS associate, right, people like families would set off firecrackers because it's so rare and it's a major occasion, so they would celebrate. And what did he submit? He actually submitted, so this submission is quite interesting, right? He submitted a very strategic submission. He submitted photographs from Singapore, images of English life, probably because RPS is in the UK, and also Vietnamese scenes of Oriental flavor. So he used his he used his Singapore present and his Vietnamese past and a projection of what would be interesting in the UK, and he made a submission. And then from then on, basically from 1953 onwards, he was always involved in the Singapore Camera Club, which later on became the Photographic Society of Singapore, what we would call PSS. Eventually, he became the vice president 1977 to 1984. And that's how he made his name through salon photography. Now, I'm going to show you some documents from the past, right? So this is actually the first Pan-Malayan photographic exhibition, 1953. Guo was the exhibition subcommittee member. He submitted his work to the exhibition. Now, you can clearly from the title, you can already sense that there was a desire to create a kind of Pan-Malayan identity through this exhibition. I mean, this is obviously not the first time an attempt was made through photography to create a Pan-Malayan identity. There were already attempts even before the war, but after the war, this was one of the most visible attempts, or the first attempts to create a kind of Pan-Malayan identity through photography. Now, we have a few jury members. One of the jury members is this gentleman called Major Raymond Thomas. So you can quite clearly see he's a British Army officer. He's also a member of RPS, the Royal Photographic Society. He was a chief engineer of the Far East Land Forces in Singapore. Now, in his jury statement, his commentary of the exhibition, he wrote something like this. There is a band of workers who have been internationally recognized as the Hong Kong School. May the day come soon when we can speak also of the Malayan School. So you can see really interesting that at this point, where there was an attempt to create a Malayan identity of photography, Hong Kong was raised as a point of reference. So instead of telling you what is Malayan, what is exactly Malayan about Malayan photography, Hong Kong was raised as a specter or a way of comparing or referencing, a role model for the Malayan photographers to aspire to in order to create a Malayan kind of photography. But what exactly is this Malayan photography? There's no mention. Now, so you see some of these images of Guo Shanghui. So the image on the left is a very typical classical pose image, not pose image, a classical image of salon photography, very well composed, you know, at the golden two-third. The subject is at the two-third, right in the middle by the two-third in terms of the vertical. Then on the right, you can see Lang Jingshan actually. So Lang Jingshan actually used to come to Southeast Asia quite often. And so this is a younger Chinese photographer in some ways trying to pay respect to older Chinese Asian masters of salon photography. But apart from doing salon photography, apart from participating in competitions, apart from joining the clubs, Guo Shanghui also published his work on the newspapers. So in 1954, he was already starting to publish some of his photographs, not surprisingly about Vietnam, since he just arrived from Vietnam and still had family in Vietnam, probably, that he started publishing his work on the Singapore paper called Nanyang Shangbao, which I'm going to talk about and refer to quite often later. And he also started writing about photography. So this is actually at the occasion of the 5th Pan-Malayan Photographic Exhibition. So this is 1957. Guo Shanghui wrote a review for the Nanyang Shangbao. And my translation of a paragraph here is, to the people in the world today, Malaya and Singapore are known not only for the rubber, tin, paddy, and pineapples from her soils, but also the art of photography, which requires human intelligence and skills to create, nourishing our lives. So I think for some of our friends here who are maybe researching on Malayan Chinese or Malaysian Chinese or Singapore Chinese literature, the tropes of the rubber, the tin, the paddy, the pineapple plantation, right? Recurring tropes in literature, Chinese literature coming out of Malaya, Malaysia, and Singapore. You can see that Guo Shanghui also evokes these tropes in his writing of photography, but also then trying to put forth a kind of Malayan or Singapore identity of what it means to make photography here. Now, as I was trying to research or try to flesh out his life, I realized that as a salon photographer and also as a member of the Photographic Society of Singapore, he was involved in many different exhibitions. And he was consistently involved in all these exhibitions, which went from the colonial period, the late colonial period, to the period of self-determination in Singapore, which is 1959, to the period where Singapore was part of Malaysia in 63, and to the period when Singapore was ousted from Malaysia and when PAP became the state in 1965 onwards. And so throughout this long history, salon photography was always used by the different states for different kinds of political, cultural, social projects. So much so that I realized that salon photography, at least to the elites, the national elites or the state elites, seems like a kind of cure-all. It seems like salon photography could be used for all sorts of different purposes. So you can see in 1962, an oil company from America collaborated with the Photographic Society of Singapore to organize something called This is Singapore, which is an exhibition and a competition, which is really to promote the intention, stated intention was to promote the national consciousness. So of course we are at, the beginning stages of nation, well, not the beginning stages, but the budding stages of nation building, and then to encourage citizens to take greater interest in the local environment. So today, on today's, looking back from today's vantage point, right, you would be wondering why an oil company from America would be involved in such a nation building project, right? But then in '63, you again see the Ministry of Culture again collaborating with the Tamil Club, to put out a contest and exhibition, basically to promote Singapore on the global world and to allow people to understand Singapore's multiracial reality. 65, just before Singapore was being kicked out of Malaysia, PAP organized a photo contest to promote its Malaysia for Malaysian stance. So you can see, and then in 71, this is a community club in Singapore. When they wanted to promote a clean and beautiful image of the nation overseas, again, they incorporated the praxis of salon photography, the contest culture of salon photography into their social project. And one of the stated aims of this competition was really to divert young people away from vices, from bad influence. So salon photography here was seen as this very good hobby, healthy hobby to keep young people away from the bad influence. And even in 81, right, this is another kind of like a residential community, when they were trying to organize a contest to promote neighborliness, again, they turned to the praxis of salon photography. So you can see salon photography, at least to the state, or at least to the state elites, seemed like this kind of cure-all for all sorts of different issues that they could mobilize salon photography to address. And Guo Shanghui was actually involved in every single one of them, either as a participant, organizer, a jury member, in all those different capacities. But beyond salon photography, he very quickly developed an interest on the Singapore River. So this is him evolving beyond the praxis of salon photography, beyond the competition mode of salon photography. And so he saw this Singapore River as a kind of mother river of Singapore, and he was determined to keep an archive of images regarding the Singapore River. So these are some of his images that he shot. And then later on, he evolved and became an architectural photographer. So he was commissioned to photograph the reconstruction of the Overseas Chinese Banking Corporation. So this was the original China building, the headquarters for the Overseas Chinese Banking Corporation, OCBC, completed in 1932. By the start of 1970s, the demolition was underway, and the architect for this building was actually I.M. Pei. So I think this is I.M. Pei's second project outside of the States. And so Guo Shanghui was commissioned to photograph the construction of the OCBC building. So on one hand, when we look at Guo Shanghui's photographs, right, they may look quite apolitical. But as I said earlier, the photograph is only one possible outcome of his experiences as a Chinese male Singaporean salon photographer. So instead of automatically chastising Guo as conservative or championing him as some kind of photographic modernist, we should try to reconstruct his experiences using the concepts of embodiment and his desire. Not just his desire, actually, but also the state desire of mobilizing salon photography. Now, what happened was that Guo Shanghui passed away in 1988. Eventually, in 2007, his family donated his archive to the National Library, which was the reason why we are then commissioned to do the book for him, because that's part of, the agreement when his family donated the photographs to the National Library of Singapore. Now, I just want to end this section on Guo Shanghui by pointing out this article. So in 1981, Guo Shanghui was actually appointed to be a guide. At that year, the Korean president, Chun Do-hwan, was actually going to visit Singapore. So the Korean TV actually came to make a documentary, a TV series about Singapore. And Guo Shanghui was hired to be the guide. And then he wrote about his experiences on Nanyang Shangbao in 1981. And I translate. As the guide of this TV series, I feel honored because I have the opportunity to introduce to the South Korean leadership and its people the most progressive, most heroic, and most beautiful impressions of our nation. I'm not like some people who bring foreigners to our nation's slums, Sago Lane. So you can see here, you have this person born in Vietnam, becoming Singaporean, and then, very proud of being a Singaporean, and clearly in the essay, and trying to show the best side of Singapore to the external world. And then he mentioned this place, which he calls the nation's slum, Sago Lane. I will come back to Sago Lane in the next person's example. And this next person is K.F. Wong, or Huang Jiefu. So his story is different, obviously, from Guo Shanghui. Guo Shanghui is a Cantonese born in Vietnam. K.F. Wong, actually, he is a Heng Hua or Putian origin, but he was born in Sungai Merah in Cebu, Sarawak. His Chinese name is called Huang Jiefu. His parents actually were probably Christian peasants, quite poor, who were recruited by the regional Methodist network, who moved them from Putian, Heng Hua, to somewhere in Cebu, which was then under the rule of the White Raja. So you can see Cebu here. So they were there, obviously, to open up the land for agricultural cultivation. So Guo Shanghui K.F. Wong was born there. And then, as they said, very young, he caught the photography bug. And then he was sent back to China. His parents actually wanted him to learn art, but he decided also to pursue photography. So he learned photography as well in China, in China, and then later on he became an apprentice in this studio in Xiamen called the Anna Studio, 1937. And then after that, when the onset of the Second Sino-Japanese War, he came back to Sarawak, and then he opened his own Anna Studio in Kuching in 1938. 1941, he opened the Anna Studio branch in his hometown of Cebu. Now, the other thing that's quite important is that in 1947, after the war, he opened Straits Photographers, which is another photo studio. So this is a commercial studio in Singapore. So he came to Singapore very, very frequently in the 40s, in the 50s, and in the 60s. By 1956, though, he relinquished control of the Straits photographers. So his business moved back to Sarawak. So the Ana studio was always in existence, but he used to also own another studio in Singapore. So he started out as a studio photographer, doing portraits, taking commissions, recording events, and sometimes even producing images for news publications. So I'm going to illustrate some of his life from this publication, which was published in China, dedicated to K.F. Wong, published in 1995, calling him a world-famous photographer, right? So this is an image that was taken by K.F. Wong at the Padang. So this is the open field in Singapore in 1946. As I said, after the war, for the next decades, K.F. Wong was frequently in Singapore because he had business there. So the building behind is the old court, and which is now the National Gallery of Singapore. So I'll come back to that image later. And then, of course, K.F. Wong, like most of the photographers at the time, wanted to be known as an artist. How would you be known as an artist? So you would have to join salon photography clubs and participate in salon photography competition. So apart from the Pan-Malayan photography exhibition, Singapore also had another exhibition which actually started earlier. It's called the First Open Photographic Exhibition in 1950. So this is also a competition which led to the opportunity of having an exhibition. And this is again under the umbrella of the British-backed Singapore Art Society, which is really a society that exists under the British umbrella of art and cultural societies in Singapore. So they organized this exhibition, which were open to people from all over the world. So you receive submissions from all over the world. Whereas Pan-Malayan photographic exhibition, the submissions typically come from Malaya, however you want to define that term. So K.F. Wong participated in this exhibition, and you can see on on your right, this was the winning shot for that year. It was the silver medal for pictorial work. So you can see that's a typical salon photography image. It's a still life image. So it mimics the category of painting, still life painting, very well lit. The emphasis is on technical competency, technical wizardry, good lighting, aesthetics, and atmosphere. And that was actually because he won so that was the highest award of that year for pictorial submission. And that was also the occasion where K.F. Wong met for the first time Malcolm McDonald, the Commissioner General for Southeast Asia, who was known as a very important art patron. Now, if you look at the third annual exhibition of photographs, right? So this is the third open photographic exhibition organized in 1952. When you look at the prize winners and how they list all the details of the exhibitions, you would see this kind of like image of, the emerging nations or the nations that were about to emerge, like Singapore, alongside, established nations like the States, and of course also alongside India, you have England, you have Hong Kong. So you have this kind of like, I would say maybe a kind of illusion of nations among equals. And that's actually, the workings of circulation, because the photographer submits to a foreign competition, gets recognition, get listed on the catalog, and by being listed on the catalog, they represent the places where they come from, creating this impression of nations amongst equals. At the same time, K.F. Wong's work, away from salon photography, started appearing on the papers. So you can see that his work started appearing on the Straits Times, which was maybe to put in a little bit of a historical context, obviously a kind of colonial paper. And also on its very popular Straits Times Annual, which is the magazine that they put out once a year. And it circulated not just in Malaya, but also back to the metropole, to the UK, and from there to Europe. So K.F. Wong's work started circulating on the publication. Now, I'm going to take a quick digression and talk about Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong was, as I already intimated right at the start, Hong Kong was a really important reference point for salon photographers in Southeast Asia. You can see this news report from Singapore, Free Press, published in 1959, written by Sunny Giam, who is also another important salon photographer. And he writes in this article, Singapore's salon exhibitors are not merely interested in Hong Kong photographers. They are feverishly infatuated. So Hong Kong was really an important reference point for photographers in Southeast Asia and in Singapore. One of the major reasons was because Hong Kong was the place where Chinese language magazines focusing on salon photography and also kind of street photography, Hong Kong was the place where many of these publications come from. So a very famous, an important magazine, but which only lasted for 1 year, is this publication called Chinese Photography. Hopefully I have time towards the end to talk more about this, but so you can see in 1950, K.F. Wong's work already appeared on this Hong Kong publication called Chinese Photography. This submission by K.F. Wong is titled Malaya 的几个镜头, focus on Malaya, right? But the title is actually erroneous because the images, many of the images actually come from Indonesia. So there is this misrecognition by the Hong Kong publication on, K.F. Wong's submission. Then you have another this one I would consider a very important publication coming out of Hong Kong. It's called 世界摄影 or World Photography. And you can see again, hopefully I have time to talk more about this towards the end during the conclusion period. And again, you can see K.F. Wong's image work. Okay, so this magazine, I just have to say that, was in existence from 1952 to 1958. And you can see K.F. Wong's work being published, let's say in 1956, the image on the left is a very iconic image of K.F. Wong. And then of course, moving away from Hong Kong, his work was also published in photo book. So this is his first photo book called Pagan Innocence. It was actually published in London by Jonathan Cape in 1960. And over time, actually, K.F. Wong made a name by photographing the indigenous people of Sarawak and literally using their bodies to first of all, put Sarawak on the global map, on the tourist map, but also put his name circulating in the global world. And not surprisingly, the person that wrote the foreword to this book is actually Malcolm McDonald, who heralded K.F. Wong as the magician of his camera. Coming back to Hong Kong, there is another very important publication called the Photo Art, which was in circulation from 1960 to 63. Again, you see K.F. Wong's image being published. So here the focus is on his indigenous ethnographic photography in Borneo. Right. So K.F. Wong literally was the most famous Southeast Asian photographer of that period of time. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about a little bit of his connection with patronage. Now, in 1968, he made this single edition, special edition album called Borneo Pictures, which he presented to the Sultan of Terengganu, which is this state on the east coast of West Malaysia. So you can see Sultan Ismail on your right. He was also a salon photographer. He was apparently the first Malay to be made an associate of the Royal Photographic Society. So this is a present from K.F. Wong, a unique edition, to the king. Later on, Sultan Ismail became the king of Malaysia between 1965 to 1970. So I'm just going to very quickly show some of the images from this album that he presented to the king. So you can see, you can already detect his close proximity to power, not just to Malcolm McDonald, but also to the indigenous political elites. But also, when we look at this photograph, which was most likely taken during Queen Elizabeth's first trip to Asia in 1972. So this was obviously a commissioned photograph. So K.F. Wong was commissioned to record this historic visit of the Queen to Sarawak. And then this image was, of course, later reproduced as a postcard. Now, you have to be selected to be commissioned to photograph such an event. So K.F. Wong was clearly the photographer of choice, and he was commissioned to record this event. Finally, I'm going to talk about this I will hopefully again, towards the end, I'll have more time to talk about this publication, but the most iconic publication coming out of Hong Kong related to salon photography is this publication called 摄影画报, which was in existence from 1964 to 2005, nearly for 41 years. And also, again, you can see KF Wong's image, right, being published, for instance, in the 1975 issue. Again, Sarawak people, right, a spread of photographs. I just want you to take note of this image on your left. So you can see some of these images. And you will see that actually the image that first appeared, or the image that appeared on the publication, was also actually produced as a postcard. And so the postcard is credited to KF Wong, but it's actually published in Ireland by the John Hind Limited, which is a very big publisher of postcards. So this is another way where you literally put Sarawak and Borneo on the tourist map through the circulation of postcards. And really interestingly, 1974, Tun Razak went to Beijing and shook hands with Mao Zedong in Beijing. And a year later, KF Wong was able to revisit the motherland. So this is really KF Wong as the exemplary overseas Chinese, right? Revisiting the motherland as early as 1975, because we know for a fact that even though connection was started to be established in 1974, it was really, really difficult in the subsequent decades to actually get a tourist visa to go in either way, going to Malaysia or going to China. So KF Wong, the fact that he could go so early back to his to the motherland, I suspect was because he had some connection with the political elites. But in any case, he published, what he saw in the motherland on the iconic Photo Pictorial, which is the magazine that hopefully we will have some time to look at. Now, I come back to this early image that I talked about. So in 46, he photographed this image at the Padang. Now in 1987, the National Archives of Singapore organized a competition called the Historical Photographs Competition. And then he finally submitted this image 41 years after it was made. And then it won the top prize. And that led to something happened in June 1988. The Singapore National Archives purchased 2,000 photographs from Wong. And his photographs today, the 2,000 photographs mostly concern images of Singapore taken during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And those images became a very important, let's say, foundation of the National Archives of Singapore. So today, a lot of the images that we published, the state publishes in national publications concerning Singapore, right? A lot of those early images actually come from KF Wong. So here is one kind of like Malaysian photographer contributing or selling 2,000 of his photographs to the National Archives of Singapore, creating this national, let's say, helping to create this national imaginary of the young nation. And he was then given an exhibition called a solo exhibition by the National Archives, which opened in 1989. And it's called Light on Historical Moments, Images on Singapore. The guest of honor was actually Rajat Ratnam, the former Minister of Culture, and also, a very important member of the first PAP cabinet, right-hand man of Lee Kuan Yew, and the person that is typically seen to be interested in culture. And coming to the exhibition and opening the exhibition, Raja actually kind of like contextualized the exhibition as a way where images of daily life could help to shape our memory and our understanding of this young nation. So he gave a certain understanding to the images of KF Wong. Now, I'm going to come back to Sago Lane before we can take a quick break. Now, earlier I mentioned Guo Shanghui's example, right? So he said that he would not bring foreigners to the nation's slum and to places like the Sago Lane. So what is actually at Sago Lane? So Sago Lane, today, if you go to Sago Lane today, you will see this actually. So you have the Buddha Tooth Temple on the right, and basically the street has been cleaned up. But it used to be a whole row of shop houses where there are different businesses and residences crammed together. But the place was actually known for all these deaf houses, which is really the place where single Chinese who had no kin or who were very poor, or who didn't want to live with the family or who were already sick, they would then buy or rent a bed on the second floor of the shop house to wait for their time. And then on the ground floor would be where the funeral parlor would be, so where they would have their funerals, actually. So unlike Guo Shanghui, right, who saw the idea of going to these places and bring foreigners to these places as something that is, probably not good for the impression of Singapore externally. So Guo Shanghui wanted to shield all this unsightly part of the nation from the foreigners. But K.F. Wong, I guess as an outsider, didn't have this kind of pretense. So he would also go to Sago Lane, and he would also photograph the death houses along the Sago Lane. And it's really ironic in some sense, because it was at the end of the day, when National Archives wanted to build its collection, it would choose to buy the images from K.F. Wong. Whereas for someone like Guo Shanghui, his images were eventually donated to the National Library. Now, the salon photography imagi-nary, or the kind of images that was created through people like K.F. Wong, continues to resonate, continues to circulate. So even as late as in the 1990s, when Singapore was organizing the National Arts House, the National Arts Council was trying to organize, let's say, the Singapore Festival of the Arts. And then there was an exhibition called the Distinguished ASEAN Photographers. Again, K.F. Wong, they relied on the photographers that were already recognized through the Salon Photography Network. And so K.F. Wong represented Malaysia and again circulated images of the indigenous people to Singapore, in that way helping to kind of propagate an imaginary of Malaysia. Now, I think maybe this is a good time to take a quick break. Should we take a 5 minutes?
Sure. Yeah, okay. Can you hear me, Ubin?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's wonderful. Well, you can see me writing everything you are presenting. This is so rich, and a lot of questions and a lot of ideas coming out from this. But before we continue to your third story, let's take a maybe 5 minutes break. 5 minutes break, and we will come back at 3:08. How about 3:08?
Okay.
3:08.
Yep.
Okay. Cool.
See you.
I'll see you guys very soon.
Bye.
Okay. 哇，这东西很 super rich, very rich.
好，这个是直接。
OK， 他要已经帮我控制。好
，OK，
continue。
OK。
How much time do I have left?
You still have time. Yeah, I think you can just. I think you can finish your story. Right? It's 3:10.
Do I have, because if you want me to end at 3:40, maybe I can try to finish.
Yeah, 3:40, around 3:40. Maybe end around 3. 3:40.
3:45都可以吗
？3:30或3:40 would be fine. Yeah.
No, 3:30. If you want me to end 3:30, I will drop the maybe the last section, because I don't think I can. The last section is the conclusion is quite a long conclusion.
Let's do 3:40. How about that? 3:40.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Yeah. Okay. Please welcome Wu Bin again, and let's join back to the Zoom to this really astonishing and wonderful story and the archival materials. Yeah, Wu Bin, you have the floor. Yeah.
Okay. Let's go straight for the chase. Okay, let's leave the two Chinese old men behind and come to the example of Nguyen Mac Dan. So his story is a little bit different from Guo Shanghui and K.F. Wong. So in Guo Shanghui and K.F. Wong, right, they actually made a name for themselves by first participating in salon photography exhibition and then establishing their name through, the competition circuit of salon photography. Nguyen Mac Dan actually was different. So he actually was already a news photographer, but when he was working as a news photographer, his peers felt that, you are just a news photographer, you don't really know anything about art photography. So they actually challenged him, whether he could make art photography. So he decided to participate in this very iconic exhibition. I'll come to this. In 1953, he participated in this second art photography exhibition at the Hanoi Opera House. And then over time, he won many, many awards in the salon photography circuit. And then later on, he became, of course, the Royal Photographic Society member. He also became a member of the Photographic Society of America. Then he had other nicknames like King of Pictorial Photographs, Mr. Pictorial, King of Landscape Photography. Now, what is really interesting here is that, so I'm going to talk about this very quickly about this exhibition. So in 1952, a group of photographers, including Vietnamese and Chinese photographers, living across the colony, the French colony, decided to mount what would now be seen as the first art photography exhibition at the Hanoi Opera House. So this is in 1952, the art photo exhibition in the Hanoi Opera House. Now, in the second edition, Nguyen Mac Dan actually joined the exhibition, and you can see his work here on the right side. Now, there was 3 editions, and of course, 1954, the North was taken over, and then the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was established. And so many photographers from the North actually moved down to the Republic of Vietnam, or what we would colloquially call the South Vietnam. And one of them was Nguyen Mac Dan. Nguyen Mac Dan actually moved down to the South and continued to participate in the salon photography exhibition. And it's actually really because the South, or the Republic of Vietnam, was actually a more kind of porous space connected to the so-called free world, that he was able to make a name for himself. Because in order to participate in all these salon competitions, you have to submit your work overseas. So you need postage, or you need postal connections. You need connections with other spaces. You also need, the ease of importing chemicals, ideas, papers, into Republic of Vietnam in order to sustain an art practice of photography. So it was really actually because he was there in Republic of Vietnam, and because Republic of Vietnam was connected more to the free world, so-called free world, that he was able to actually further propel his name as an art photographer. Now, very quickly, we also see, a publication like Photo Art, which I mentioned earlier, reporting on the kind of photography coming out of Vietnam. But of course, the Vietnam that they are referring to was the Republic of Vietnam and not the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north. So you can see in 1961, they printed an essay that introduces an iconic subject in Vietnamese photography. It's called the Sand Dunes, the new pictorial photographic subject in Vietnam. To be honest, even today, this remains one of the most iconic subject matter in Vietnamese photography. It's almost like everybody who were interested in art photography in Vietnam has to do something related to the sand dunes. In 1961, they printed an essay written by Nguyen Cao Tan, and was translated into Chinese, introducing this, subject matter of Vietnamese photography. So a kind of Vietnam appeared in the Chinese-speaking world through a publication called like the photo art. So on your bottom right, you see an image by Nguyen Mac Dan. Okay. But a year earlier in Singapore, our aforementioned Guo Shanghui also wrote an introduction to the photographic art of Vietnam today for the Nanyang Shangpao. So this was published in the 1960s. And it was written at the occasion of an exhibition of Vietnamese photography. Of course, an exhibition of Vietnamese photography from the South in Singapore. And again, in this article, he mentions this idea of, the sand dunes being an important, iconic kind of, let's say, trope in the work of salon photography in Vietnam. So you can see all this external circulation, being publicized, being written about in Hong Kong, in Singapore, helping to circulate, the tradition or, the iconography of Vietnamese photography. Really interestingly, Nguyen Mac Dan was later on involved in a book called Vietnam in Flames. So this was published in 1969 by the Republic of Vietnam with the assistance of the General, it was published in the South with the assistance of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Republic of Vietnam. So I think this is actually one of the most iconic publication. You could even call it a propaganda publication from the South. Nguyen Mac Dan was one of the photographers. The other photographer is this guy called Nguyen Ngoc Han, which we don't have much time to talk about, but I will just say that he was both a photographer, but also an army man. Okay, so both of them were involved in this book. So I'm going to just give you some of the excerpts of this book. I'm just going to show you some excerpts from this iconic book from the South, basically trying to represent, let's say, the conflict from the perspective of the Republic of Vietnam, or what would now be the loser's perspective.
It's fine to carry on, so don't feel pressure. You have all the time before 4, I think.
I hope I can, because I hope I can actually take some questions, because that would be helpful.
Sure,
but
But
okay.
don't feel pressure to skip some of the good stuff.
Okay. I mean, we can, if you want, we can run longer. It's not a problem, because I have time after that. Yeah.
Please go on. Yeah, please.
Okay. So you can see some of these images. I'm just going to pick out some of these images from the book. Now you can see this image. Just have a memory of this image first. And then you see this is actually the very famous attack of Hue in '68. And then, of course, this part concerns the retaking of Hue from the South. From the captions itself, you already notice that, that the publication has a certain ideological bent. I mean, no surprise, because it has to represent the Republic of Vietnam's perspective. Okay, I'm just going to run through some of the images. So you see actually a juxtaposition of combat images. And then you have all these very beautiful idyllic images. I always make fun of this image because it's like almost every Vietnamese photographer must have, an image of woman in our eye, actually. And this is actually what I mean. Like almost every Vietnamese publication has an image of woman in our eye. Okay, and then it's interspersed again with images of rehabilitation, of addressing the conflict. And then you see towards the end a sense of rebuilding. So there is an implicit rebuilding. So of course, rebuilding from some kind of destruction, right? So of course, there is an implicit cause of this destruction, which is of course to them the North. Then you see this closing sequence of 3 images. So you see again the sand dune comes back. So this iconic image of Salon photography appears again, you know, in a kind of like, you can even call this a war publication. Now we, after reunification in 1975, the other photographer, Nguyen Ngoc Han, suffered deeply at that point. I think he was sent to re-education for 8 years and suffered, but eventually he managed to leave and ended up in the States, of course, where he passed away. So he passed away remaining like very bitter towards the North, of course. I don't really know what happened to Nguyen Ngoc Han. So here is one photographer who made his name through salon photography. And because he was very famous, my suspicion is because he was very famous as a salon photographer, he was invited or he was forced to participate in this book. And then after the war, I'm not so sure what happened to him, but by 1996, he was well recuperated within the national conversation for photography in Vietnam. So in 1996, he published this book called My Homeland Vietnam, which casts Vietnam as this ceaseless, eternal Vietnam, peace-loving and never, you know, never invading others. So he published this book in Ho Chi Minh City, in the south, formerly known as Saigon, in 1996. So I'm just again going to show you some of the images, but I'm going to actually point out some of the ironies here, because some of the images that appear in what would be the iconic Republic of Vietnam or South Vietnam war publication, Vietnam in Flames, was then reused again in this national imaginary of Nguyen Ngoc Han's book. So you can see again the image of the Ao Dai women on your right, which appears in Vietnam in Flames. And then you see this image, which was published in photo art, reused in, of the sand dunes, again, reused in the book. And then, of course, you see this image, which opened the page on Hue in Vietnam in Flames. And then, of course, this final image, which actually appear as the ending sequence in Vietnam in Flames. So all these images that appeared in the publication that represented the South were all recuperated into this eternal Vietnam imaginary, seen in this book called Vietnam, My Homeland. So with that, I finish the story of 3 photographers and I come to the kind of concluding section of the presentation. Now, part 6, I'm just going to reiterate the connections between salon photography, colonial and national patronage, and state making. I think by now it's quite clear that many of these salon photographers, right, they started out as salon photographers, they made a name for themselves, and because they became famous, they inevitably, wittingly or unwittingly, got involved in state projects. You know, from as early on as, you know, the Winter Fair exhibition contest at Wat Ban in Bangkok in 1905, and right until the last, the late King Bhumibol Ramanai. So the King Bhumibol remained to be a kind of patron for the Royal Photographic Society of Thailand. In Singapore, it's the same. When the colonial state in 1922 wanted to mount a colonial fair called the Malaya Borneo exhibition, they also included salon photography, or what they call amateur photography. And they turned to the Malayan Camera Club in Kuala Lumpur to organize this exhibition. So this exhibition became part of a big spectacle, colonial spectacle in 1922 that was actually located in Singapore. Okay, so so you can still continuously see this connection between the state elite and salon photography. And this continues even at the cusp of nation building, where Lee Kuan Yew, who we know was not somebody who was really that interested in the arts, could be seen actually patronizing the 14th Singapore International Salon of Photography, 1963, was organized by the Photographic Society of Singapore at that point in time. Now, if you look at some of the exhibitions that the salon photographers, the clubs organized, right? I mentioned that this was one of the major ways where all these salon photography clubs, photo clubs, organize exhibitions and exert their influence. Now, in some of the clubs, right, some of their first exhibitions, they tend to be kind of like nation-centric, or they focus more on, let's say, participants from within the nation. If you remember let's say the Vietnam art photography exhibition, so they focus on, let's say, participants that were within the colony. In this first international photo salon of Indonesia, of course, in independent Indonesia, which was held in 1956, the focus was mainly on practitioners in Indonesia. And you can see, obviously, a kind of creation of images relating to Indonesia. But what is really interesting here, and again, a kind of like a place where the factor of Chineseness has kind of like lapsed from our attention, which is the fact that a lot of these photographers that participated in this exhibition were actually of ethnic Chinese descent. And it is actually through the work of, let's say, visual anthropologists like Karen Stressler, who actually points out the imprint of Chinese photographers in creating a national imaginary through the salon photography network in a place like Indonesia. But in other places, like for instance, in this case, the first international salon of pictorial photography held in Saigon. And of course, this has clearly a connection with the state because it was actually held during the anniversary of the Republic of Vietnam, but also hosted in the Saigon Information Hall. So this is actually a kind of like, you know, a cultural and a cultural space, which of course has connection with the state. But in the example here, you will see that this is an exhibition that is open to the world. And by listing, for instance, they would give you the statistics of where the submissions would come from, right? So you again have this illusion or this image of being amongst equals. And here actually you really see a kind of like convergence of desires, because on one hand, the salon photographer desired to be recognized for his art. And at the same time, the emerging nation desired for diplomatic recognition by other nations. So you see a convergence of desires in the framework of organizing a salon photography competition, which actually is made possible only through circulation, by submitting your work overseas, circulating your work overseas. Now, you will see that there is a submission of China here, right? Which I strongly suspect means Taiwan or Republic of China. And again, this Vietnam here is clearly Republic of Vietnam. Okay, let's move. So I come to the final section, which is a very long-winded kind of like conclusion. And I want to kind of come back to a different, a kind of like summary of a work that I was doing in Hong Kong, which is trying to resurface Hong Kong in Southeast Asia and to show through the praxis of salon photography that Hong Kong was really closely connected to Southeast Asia. And to some extent, you could say Hong Kong was actually within Southeast Asia. Now, in that body of work, which was made through a grant by the Robert Ho Family Foundation in Hong Kong, I studied actually what I would call photo periodicals, some of which I mentioned earlier. As I argued, photo periodicals, because Hong Kong was really the main space where all these Chinese language photo periodicals was being published and circulated in Southeast Asia. That helped to make Hong Kong a very important reference point for the ethnic Chinese photographers in Southeast Asia, across Southeast Asia. And I talked about this publication called 中国影艺, Chinese photography, which was very short-lived. And it's actually short-lived because for a few reasons, I suspect. One is because the establishing of New China in 1949 actually cut off a major source of readership for this publication. I think when this publication was planned, the intention was to connect China photography with the West. But with the establishing of New China, the source of readership from China was cut. And Hong Kong was never really big enough in terms of population to support a publication. So it was very short-lived, even though it was the publication itself and the founder, Francis Wu, was a very important photographer, very pompous as well, very ambitious, but I mean, the reality was that it was very difficult to get readers actually out of just selling your publication in Hong Kong. Whereas I think by the time world photography came about, which was in existence from 1952 to 1958, this was actually really the template for how a Hong Kong publication could survive. Because the reason why I would argue this is because that this publication is actually really closely connected to Southeast Asia. It has to do with this gentleman called Zhou Xingqu, who in 1934 established the World Book Company, 世界书局, in Singapore to publish and distribute books. And then in 1936, he established the popular book company, the 大众书局, to enter the retail market. So today, actually, we still have the popular book company in Malaysia, in Singapore. It used to still be in existence in Hong Kong, but I don't think it's there anymore. In 1949, actually, they established the World Publishing Company, 世界出版社, in Hong Kong. And so from Hong Kong, they started publishing a lot of periodicals, which, because of its original connection in Southeast Asia, were mainly distributed back to Southeast Asia. And that created a model of survival, that in order for Hong Kong publications to survive, actually the best way is to distribute back to Southeast Asia, where there is a big overseas Chinese readership. Now, if we take any of the issue, this is issue December 1955, you will see actually the distribution channel. So it's distributed all across Singapore, Penang, Kuala Lumpur. In Jakarta, it's actually distributed through Tai Seng Book Company, which is in Pancoran. In Surabaya, it's actually in East Java, Indonesia. It was distributed through China Book Company in Bongkaran. In Bangkok, it was in Bangkok's Chinatown in Pat Sai. So you can see actually all these spaces, right? Pancoran and Bongkaran in Jakarta and Surabaya, in Pat Sai, all these are companies that are located in the Chinatowns of Jakarta, Surabaya, and Bangkok. So you can see a kind of distribution model that mimics actually the kind of distribution of, let's say, the Chinatowns and Chinese businesses across Southeast Asia. In a publication like this, you typically would have reader submission. So this is actually reader submissions. So every issue, readers would submit their photographs to be critiqued or to be published and selected on the publication itself. So in the December 1955 issue, you have this, let's say, readers submitting from different parts of the region, right? So you'll see the name of the work, you see the name of the photographer, then you will see actually the indication of the location. Now, if you take that issue and that issue alone and look at the reader submission, this is actually the spread of its readership through Southeast Asia. So it comes from places even like Padang, from Johor, from Penang, from Phnom Penh, from Bangkok, of course from Macau, from Hong Kong, from Sabah, Kota Kinabalu, from Cebu, right? So it comes from actually all across Southeast Asia. Now, this is actually a map that I try to make for myself, right? So for the circulation of a Hong Kong photo periodical, right? So this is actually something I try to visualize in terms of the importance of its circulation. Now, post 1949, right? The capacity or the ability for a Hong Kong-made publication to circulate back into New China became very, very difficult. Hong Kong itself was too small to sustain publication. So its main market was really Southeast Asia. In some sense, this is actually a parallel to Hong Kong businesses during the Cold War, where most of the businesses actually would, in order to survive, they actually have to look towards the Southeast Asia region. Now, after the creation of the two Vietnams in 1954, circulation of Hong Kong periodicals into the Democratic Republic of Vietnam also became quite difficult. But at the same time, it opened up a different route where the DRV, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, could actually have certain publications circulating in and out of New China. And I'm talking about, let's say, the Chinese edition of Vietnam Pictorial and the Vietnamese edition of China Pictorial. So those are publications that would be able to cross this border. So after 54, there is a kind of blockage here. Now I'm going to talk about this next two publications, which is so absorbing the experience of the first two publications came these two photo publications. One is called Photo Art, which was in existence from 1960 to 1963, and then later on 1980 to 1997. Its executive editor was SF Dan. Publisher is this guy called Chan Fo Lei, and then editor is Mark Fong. Now there is another guy who was never really identified. His name is called Li Qing. So I will talk a little bit about Li Qing a little bit later, right? So this is the publication I focus mainly, in terms of photo art, I focus mainly on the period 1960 to 1963. And it has to do very much with this guy called Chan Fo Lei or Chen Fu Li. He is a Qiu Zhao Yan or Cao Zhou Ren or Teochew Nang, Teochew, born of Teochew dialect group. He had some education in China, but eventually he left and moved to Nakhon Phanom in Siam to work for his father-in-law. And then after that, from there, he moved to Hanoi and then established his business there. Because first of all, in Thailand, during the Japanese occupation, during the Pacific War, you know, the Thai government was, of course, aligned with the Japanese forces. So there was a ban on trade on the overseas Chinese. So in 1943, he moved to Hanoi to continue his business. And he set up his Thai Hua Hang, you know, marking his beginnings in Thailand, but also his ethnicity. Now, in 1951, he started already to pick up photography, and he won his first Salon Photography Award. I'm not going to focus too much on Chan Fo Lei, but he was actually one of the photographers that participated in this aforementioned art photo exhibition, 1952, in the Hanoi Opera House, which is now often seen as the first art photography exhibition, gathering all the art photographers from across the colony. So this is his submission in 1952. Now, really interestingly, when the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was established in 1954, Mr. Chan Fo Lei, actually, he voted with his feet, right? Instead of staying put in the DRV to serve the revolution, or instead of moving to Tha Kiet, which is in Laos, where his brother was based, he actually moved to Hong Kong. So this is a guy that willingly moved to be colonized by the British in Hong Kong. So you must contrast this to the other major migration at that time, which was, as New China was being established, there were thousands of overseas Chinese that went back from Malaya, Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand to serve the revolution in New China. But this gentleman instead voted by going to Hong Kong to be colonized by the British. And then in 1958, the irony though is that in 1958, he established the Xianggang Zhonghua Sheying Xuehui, the Chinese Photographic Association of Hong Kong. And very quickly, he began to be invited back to China to photograph the scenery. And of course, eventually, he became a member of the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, or 全国政协. Right? So this is on the inauguration issue of photo art, where Chen Fu Li talks about, you know, the intention of starting this publication. So here you can see that the pretense was he was speaking to and on behalf of Hong Kong and Southeast Asia. But by the end of the same issue, his executive director lumped, you know, Hong Kong back into Southeast Asia. So SF Dan actually calls photo art as the only omnibus photographic magazine published in Southeast Asia at present. So this is actually kind of like the status of Hong Kong. It slips in and out within the framing of Southeast Asia, at least when we look at all these photo periodicals. Now, to celebrate the founding of this publication, the magazine actually wanted to organize a photo contest. So from the first issue, it was marketing a photo contest, asking its readers to send their submissions. And then finally, the contest was reviewed and published on the 7th issue, which is March 1961. So we don't have the numbers in terms of its circulation, but we can have a rough sense of its reach. So apparently they received 1,000 prints coming from all these different territories and countries, right? From Brazil, Burma, Cambodia, Canada, Fiji, France, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Italy, Laos, blah, blah, blah. North Borneo, Philippines, Shanghai, Sarawak, Singapore, Taiwan, Thailand, US, South Vietnam, right? Now, the top 5 sources of submissions in descending order were Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Thailand, Republic of Vietnam. It shows that a Chinese language, well, at least at that point in time, this publication had a kind of like, photo art at that time was trying to be somewhat bilingual. So some of the articles had short English translations. So this magazine, which was mostly in Chinese, but with some English translation, right? You can see where was its major source of readership, at least if we judge by the submissions, right? It came from Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Thailand, Republic of Vietnam, at least in terms of the submission for this contest. So again, you can see Nguyen Mak Dan's work on the left, which we have already seen a few times, winning the gold medal in the competition. Now, finally, I'm going to talk about the long-standing, probably the most iconic magazine that was published in Hong Kong. It's called Photo Pictorial, 摄影画报. It lasted for 41 years. And because of the work of researcher, our friend in Hong Kong, Li Wenqi or Kalen Lee, we now am able to know quite a lot more. We are now able to know a lot more about the backstory of photo art and also Photo Pictorial, because these two publications are connected. Because when photo art was stopped, then it created an opportunity for Photo Pictorial to be established. The reason why photo art was stopped was because photo art was deemed to be too highbrow for the advertisers. So it had trouble trying to attract advertisers. So after reorganization, they decided to bring out a kind of more popular, more reader-friendly publication, which is this Photo Pictorial, which lasted for 41 years. Its initial interest was in salon photography and a kind of street photography. Again, the publisher was Chan Fo Lei, editor was Mark Fong. Again, Li Qing was behind it until his death in 1973. And through the work of Kalen, by interviewing and inviting some people to write about the publication, we now know that Li Qing actually was connected to Liao Chengzhi, who was actually the chair of the Overseas Chinese Affairs Commission in China. And apparently the instruction was to find or to establish a photography publication to unite the Hong Kong photographers and to influence Southeast Asia, and in turn to resist prostitution, gambling, and drug trafficking, and to reduce the effect of British colonialism. So if you remember this notion of salon photography as a cure-all, it seems that even for the people coming from New China, they also had this idea that salon photography could solve all the issues. So Li Qing was actually instructed to establish a photo magazine to do just that. But despite all these very kind of like seemingly morally correct intentions, right? You will see that in the first issues or the first early issues of Photo Pictorial, they actually use women and their body to actually influence, or you can say tutelate, Southeast Asia, right? And if the cover is not clear enough, if you look at what appears inside, you will see a lot of this kind of like images that was published in the context of this kind of like photo periodical. So this is probably, so the way I would understand this is that in order for the revolution to work, first you would have to put the bodies of women up for exploitation first. But of course that quickly obviously ran into a problem, because in many places in the emerging nations of Southeast Asia, especially in Singapore, very quickly there was a kind of anti-yellow movement. So if a publication like Photo Pictorial wants to circulate into Singapore, they would of course have to tone down the content, which of course subsequently they did. Now, looking at photo art and Photo Pictorial as a whole, I'm going to end quite soon. One of the things that they did for Southeast Asia, and at least for the overseas Chinese readers in Southeast Asia, was that it helped to sustain the umbilical cord between the motherland and the Chinese overseas. So you can see Chen Fuli being invited to go back to China to photograph the landscape, and his work was of course published in his own magazine quite conveniently. And these images of Huangshan, Yellow Mountain, would then circulate through Southeast Asia and would continue to kind of remind the Chinese overseas, I argue, of their connection to this eternal motherland. And of course, we talked about this submission from K.F. Wong, the exemplary overseas Chinese who revisited the motherland as early as 1975. But were there other responses from the readers coming from Southeast Asia? It's very difficult to say, right? Because it's very hard to say what's the reception or what's the response of this kind of like attempts to sustain a connection with the motherland. It's really difficult to show. But in issue 111, which was published in 15 October 1974, there was a certain photographer by the name of Li Minghai or Lai Minghoi. I actually am trying to find out more about this person because I cannot find information about this person, which is quite rare because most of the salon photographers at that time you will be able to find them if you look at old catalogs. But I was unable to find more information about him. But in any case, he was said to be a photographer from Malaysia, and he submitted this cover image. So this cover image was apparently made by him. It's really a kind of juxtaposition of, you know, the Hall of Prayer for Good Harvest, which is actually from the Temple of Heaven in Beijing, and then juxtaposed on the heart of the pineapple. The image was titled 身处梨园思故乡故国, which the magazine translated as Motherland in the Heart. But if you translate it more literally, it will be thinking of the mother nation in a pineapple plantation. And of course, the pineapple plantation, of course, as I mentioned already earlier, is a common trope in Malayan Chinese literature, right? But at the same time, so moving beyond this connection, this attempt to sustain a connection between the overseas Chinese or the Chinese overseas in Southeast Asia with the mainland, you also see again the idea of circulation. How, for instance, photo art circulated a certain imagery of Sarawak. And here again, the indigenous bodies are put to use. And by a litany of ethnic Chinese photographers based in Sarawak, photographing them in order to be published on Photopictorial. So you can see in March 1975, you see a submission, for instance, from Huang Wei Zhou, you know, again, images coming from of the indigenous people in Sarawak. Another issue of Photopictorial, another submission by another person, Shen Yingxian, also of, you know, the Dayak at the Longhouse. And you can see it's not surprising because the reason why so many people would do that kind of work, would repeat that kind of iconography, was because they are following in the footsteps of K.F. Wong, who established himself by publishing in all these kind of publications all over the world, but especially in Hong Kong. So they are merely copying or following in the steps of K.F. Wong, photographing the indigenous people, thinking that that would be the fastest way for them to make a name for themselves and be published in a very prestigious photo periodical in Hong Kong. So it's really kind of ironic in the sense that for these Chinese photographers, some of them actually born in Sarawak, it seems like the cultures and lives of the Sarawak Chinese was not really attractive or maybe not even exotic enough for them to photograph and submit to the photo pictorials, contests and submissions. So their focus was singularly located on the indigenous bodies. Now, so as a kind of like closure, I will also again visualize the circulations of a Hong Kong photo periodical, and this is at the onset of the new order when Suharto took power. So when Suharto took power, of course, there was a de facto ban of Chinese culture in Indonesia, and that was the point where publications coming out of Hong Kong would start to have problems circulating into Indonesia. And if you read the editorial of Photo Pictorial, they also mentioned that Indonesia was a major market for them until, they didn't mention the exact date, but basically after the fall of Sukarno and the coming of power of Suharto in the New Order regime, it became very difficult for the publication to circulate into Indonesia. But interestingly enough, Indonesian photographers continued to be featured in the publication throughout the 70s and the 80s. And I suspect because people still continue to move, people continue to travel. So Indonesian photographers could still, because some of them are Chinese, obviously, they could still visit Hong Kong, and they could also even visit Singapore, Malaysia, where they could actually pick up a copy of the magazine. So the ban was not really 100% watertight, because they could still pick up the magazine from Malaysia, Singapore, from Hong Kong. They could still submit their work from Malaysia and Singapore, or they would even visit Hong Kong and submit their work from there. So the ban was never really watertight. But the other factor that came about was actually at the fall of Indochina in 1975. Well, the fall of Indochina in 1975. And that again created another blockage where publications from Hong Kong, Chinese publications from Hong Kong would have trouble circulating into the Indochina region. But a few years later, the end of the Cultural Revolution actually meant that China became more and more a major, let's say, source of influence for a publication coming out of Hong Kong. In the case of Photo Pictorial, it was the first publication in Hong Kong, first photo publication in Hong Kong, where you can actually officially subscribe from mainland. So the end of Cultural Revolution, and starting from the late 70s and early 80s onwards, China increasingly became an important source of readership and customers, and actually also a source of images, because China photographers started submitting to Photo Pictorial. And that's actually when the connection of Hong Kong, or at least the connection of a Hong Kong photo periodical, started to become less and less connected to the region of Southeast Asia. So these are additional factors that resulted in the decline of the connection. Certainly by the end of the 1980s and certainly by the 1990s, the factor of Southeast Asia was no longer as important or nearly forgotten. If we look at, let's say, the life of a Hong Kong photo periodical. And with that, I can finally end my publication. Sorry for running over time. Thanks.
Hi. First of all, let's give a round of applause to Dr. Zhuang Wubin for his wonderful research. And again, I'm so every time I listen to your talk, I have to admit I'm astonished by how you began to. Of course, this is like long years of. Wubin, can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah. So I can just without microphone. Anyway, again, this is every time I listen to your talk, I couldn't help but be wondered like when and how you began to notice, first of all, notice the phenomenon. How do you become a sort of like a detective, 很像侦探一样, sort of like a detective of photography history, and also you connecting all the dots geopolitically, financially, also in terms of the network of human relation, especially you highlighted a lot of these so-called actors, 这个里面的演员或者这个扮演 actors like the patrons or the patronage or the buyers, the producers, and the political players such as you said Li Guangyao and other Suharto. So I think I'm most astonished by how you managed to map out all the different layers of network in terms of different meaning, difference in terms of different senses, the political network, human relation network, the circulation, as you mentioned multiple times, the circulation of human capital, but also the images themselves, and also, I think at the end of the talk, the most important network of the publication network, which I think is a very enlightening or inspiring to me, because when I was doing my own research on Taiwan KMT propaganda network, the connecting so-called, as you said, the free world, the Cold War free zone, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and part of Southeast Asia, that I also had to rely a lot on tracing the periodicals. And what you've told us is actually very surprising to me that Hong Kong suddenly emerged as, well, come back to the word infrastructure. I feel like Hong Kong becomes that very infrastructure of distribution and circulation. So it plays, in a sense, that Hong Kong itself become a medium. You can even say that Hong Kong become a kind of a medium or media in this geopolitical mapping of network. I have so many questions, so I guess I'll take my privilege as the moderator, but also I'll open the floor to the Q&A section very soon. But before that, I want to ask a very basic question, very just to open up the atmosphere and lighting of the salon of the Zoom. Is that how I never got the chance to ask you how you began to trace, began your career, I would say curatorial and detective career of photography of Southeast Asia. How did you, probably the beginning moment, how did you begin? Was it inspired by the print culture, or was it some kind of chancy, the accidental chances that drove you into this archive of photograph and print culture? What was the very, the moment or the inspiring moment that you delved into the archive and began your travel? And second question, how did you manage to gather, because all your materials is a kind of reconstruct, a lot of involving reconstruction of a network, transnational network of media objects, of human relationship across different political regime, across different political periodization. But how did you manage to physically acquire and talk to so many people? Because I could imagine that you have to talk to so many people, interview them, acquire the raw materials, the negatives even. How did you manage to cross all these borders yourself as a researcher? Yeah, I think I will just begin with these two questions. And also, by the same token, how did you get your patronage? Like, because I think I can imagine all this collecting and curating, it takes also support, right? So I'm asking this on behalf of some of my students who are interested in curating as practices, curating as research or artistic research as you're doing. I think one of the key is how to secure support yourself. Just like the photographers you are talking about, they also need to partner with different source of power and source of money. And I think this is also important for us as researchers and you as the curators and researchers. How did you secure those network for your own work? Yeah, I think this is like a basic, really logistical question. Yeah, okay. And I think we can take question. Feel free to ask question later. Wu-Bin, I think you can
okay.
talk a little bit, and then we can take more questions.
Yes,
from now.
yeah. Please send the question, because I think the questions will help me kind of like will help my future work for sure. So I'm looking forward to the questions. You actually asked 3 questions, right? Basically, you're trying to ask about my kind of like my work background. It's kind of like boring if I go through everything. But I will just say that I see myself primarily, right now at least, I see myself primarily as a writer. I don't really see myself as a curator that much. So I started with a very naive idea, because I was not really connected to, so I started with a very naive idea because I was not really doing this as a PhD. I was not really doing this as part of a research institute. I was just interested. I was interested in photography. I was trying to be a photographer, but at the same time, I knew I could write because I had a background in writing. So I was trying to just survive as a freelancer, as an independent writer. So I had to, 自由撰稿, right? So it's the easiest. You just You just work as an independent writer. You find something that you're interested to write about, and then you submit to magazines. That's actually how I started. Now, but after a while, I realized that I wanted to do something that's much more focused. And eventually, I came to the topic of Southeast Asian photography. Now, I think for the majority of my career, I worked without funding. So I was really I was really more interested in, so it's just a curious, let's say it's my personal curiosity, because at that point in time, I have this impression that we don't really know much about photo history of Southeast Asia. That's my impression at that time. Whether it's right or wrong, we can contend about it now. But 15 years ago, when I first started out, 2004 or 2003, I thought that yeah, okay, we didn't know much about the developments of photography in Southeast Asia. That's my limited impression. So I wanted to, so my idea was really simple, just to go and interview all the people who are still, who I think is, who first of all, I think is interesting and who are still around. So I will go and interview them, because that's actually the easiest way for me to have the material to write. Right? I mean, that's obviously I mean, ethnography and oral history, right, is the easiest method in some ways if you don't have a lot of money. So I don't have a lot of money, so I have to, that's the easiest way. So that's how I accumulated materials. So that, I think, answer your question. That's actually how I accumulated so many materials, actually, which many of the oral histories that I have actually interviewed and I collected, I have not yet used. So in the book that I published, I probably only use less than 50%. Yeah, so there's still plenty of materials I haven't used yet. But I'm glad I started early, because some of these people, of course, passed. So I'm glad I did that early, because, so not because I had some conscious planning, but just like 误打误撞, right? Like you just like some foolish guy doing some foolish thing and end up having something. So so that's how I have the material. The problem, the difficulty for me doing archival work when you don't have money is because archival work usually it requires time. So if you don't have money or you don't have income as a source, right, that means you are burning your own bank account. So for me, doing archival work was really impossible. So I actually never really did archival work in the true sense of sitting in an archive and excavating stuff. At least not in the first 10 years. I never really consciously do it. But what I actually did was, whenever I see an old photographer, or whenever I even see a young photographer, what I try to do is I try to create a digital low-res archive of what they have. So I ask them to share some of the materials that they have, either of their own work or even of their own collection. Now, of course, people will not share their collection with you for no reason. You, of course, have to have good connection with them over many, many years. Then they will show you some of their stuff. So whenever I see something, I will just photograph everything and keep a low-res archive in my archive first. So I create a digital archive, which, frankly, I don't know how to look through because it's a mess. But anyway, so there's material there. So then later on, as I got like slightly, I guess if you hang around long enough and you don't die, people realize that you are still around. So they'll give you some opportunities to do some work, right? So later on, I had the opportunity to, for instance, my friends in Hong Kong, I have a lot of friends in Hong Kong, right? So some of them got me involved in residency programs and research stints, right? That's really the point in time where I had the chance of getting funding, and that's really the time where I can actually sit down and look through all these materials and try to excavate the materials, basically. That's what, to answer your question. So that actually came much later. So right now I'm doing more of that, but that's, of course, 10 years after I did, let's say, oral history interviews and trying to create low-res digital archive of stuff. Now, so that's actually how my so-called patronage, if any, right, comes about. I'm still working independently. You know, of course, I now have an adjunct, but still I'm working independently. So, yeah, my like everybody, I just apply for funding, and I would say that I would maybe say one thing, that my work is more appreciated outside of Singapore. So I find it very strange that I'm kind of like in this conversation where you have 3 Singapore-based like speakers, I kind of like, basically I'm unwanted here. So
really?
Yeah, I think so. I think they can't be bothered waiting for me to die. So so yeah, basically, so most of my, literally every single support I receive, I can say that literally. I mean, of course, I was educated in Singapore. So if you want to say, well, you are educated in Singapore, leh. So of course, yeah, I'm educated in Singapore. Yeah, but and I drink Singapore water if you want to. But other than that, every single kind of like source of support came from Hong Kong, Indonesia. I mean, of course, being invited to talk all this, in Taiwan and Southeast Asia, all these are forms of support. Yeah.
Well, I think Taiwan should totally, be more aggressive about recruiting you as some kind of permanent curator of some sort. I think this is like, yeah. So I think there are some questions. Let's for the interest of time. I think there's some question in the chat box. I think Tang Huiyu in the chat box asked a question. Thank you, Ngopeng. Do I pronounce it right? Ngopeng.
Yeah, that's actually the Hokkien pronunciation of my Chinese name.
Yeah, the Hokkien one. For the informative and rich presentation. My question is, the photographers you presented today, their careers were mostly undergoing the social historical period of decolonization since post-war. How does that may have affected their photographic practices? I mean, I guess it's how the process of post-war decolonization and the rise of the new nation states might have changed their career track or their practices. I think that's the question. Yeah.
I actually, if you look at the three photographers that I presented, so I didn't really kind of like foreground this, because in some of my talks, I would foreground the idea of decolonization. But in this case, I did not really foreground this. What I want to say, I'm not saying anything new because many other scholars have already talked about this, and just using what they have actually recognized and established through their valuable research, right? You of course see the entanglements between decolonization, nation building, and Cold War. So these are three factors that you cannot really, and then of course imperialization or de-imperialization. So you cannot really you cannot easily disentangle all these strands, and the way they affect all the three photographers. For the lack of an example, we use the three photographers here, right? So they act on them on many different ways. But I would just say that that they also had a certain kind of agency. So they while it's, if you look at the case of, so for the three photographers, they always retain a certain agency despite all the political. Well, I think you can say actually for all the photographers, all the salon photographers, that there was always a kind of, what's the best way to put this? There was always a kind of contestation between what they wanted to do. So what are their individual desires and what are the broader, let's say, institutional political desires, and that's where I would locate all this, like decolonization, Cold War, nation building. I call this kind of like institutional desires. So there's always this tug of war between the individual desire and the institutional desire, or institutional desires, because there are multiple desires, multiple competing political affinities, even at one spot. You take Hong Kong post 1949, right? So there will be the operatives of the communists, there will be the operatives of the free world, there will be, secret agents from Southeast Asia stationed in Hong Kong. Yeah, so it's actually a space where different political affinities are working upon. You can also say that actually in Singapore or in Malaya, or even actually in Suharto's Indonesia. So there were always these factors acting upon them. So the salon photographers had to negotiate between their individual desire and all these competing institutional desires or political affinities. And and they had to navigate away. I cannot say that I cannot make a conclusion in terms of how it had affected them, because if you look at the last example of Nguyen Mak Dan, so he was born in the north, participated in apparently the first Vietnam art photography exhibition, but when the north was taken over by the communists and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was established in the north, he actually moved to the south. And then went and lived in Republic of Vietnam for 30 years. Before reunification, he participated in what was the most iconic Republic of Vietnam war publication, Vietnam in Flames. But later on, after reunification, his images could then be recuperated within this new reunited Vietnam under the national imaginary. So from his example alone, we can see how, I mean, if you use a simple, let's say left or right dichotomy, right? This guy was probably forced to participate, forced to collaborate, because as a person at that point in time, you don't really have that much. You didn't have that many choices. But as the situation changed, the same body of work could then be reinvented in a different way. But maybe in some sense, right? But maybe in some sense, I would actually also argue that there was always still a national imaginary for the Republic of Vietnam. So it was not as though the Republic of Vietnam was just this puppet of America, puppet of American imperialism. There was always also a national imaginary for them, as opposed to the national imaginary of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north. Right? So there was always that, there was probably more than just these two imaginary of Vietnam. So I don't know whether I answer Hui's question.
I can sort of echo these questions by saying that we think this is important to sort of distinguish the institutional, as you said, the institutional desire of, so to speak, nation building or propaganda, as you wish, and the individual imaginary about what the national space or what the ethnic space should be. So I would, in my own research on cinema, propaganda cinema, I also sort of try to highlight this sort of discrepancy and how it will be interesting to see how between these two desires, there will be some kind of negotiation going on at the surface of the screen or the surface of your negatives. Yeah, to see how that contested desire play out in terms of the visual or the in your case the visual, in my case the audio visual phenomenon. I think this is like a very always linger around the question. But for a lot of time in my own research, there will be those decisions of the post-war decolonization and their patronage. Sometimes the factor behind is simply where the money is, because the state simply provide more, for example, cinema equipment or better equipment or better opportunity socially or politically for some of those who are interested in moving upward.
Can I just say one minor thing, which is I think maybe I have to recalibrate the word institutional desires, because I don't want to give the sense that this is something that was really formal. Because if we think about it in relation to, let's say, if we go to Malaya in 1950s and 1960s, we are really talking about different competing political affinities. Socialism, let's say Malay left, let's say, Chinese-speaking left, or you're talking about, let's say, representatives of the Islamic movement. So you are talking about different political affinities. So maybe I should recalibrate the term, because I don't want to give the impression that this was something that was really formal. But just to say that it's just to separate a certain kind of individual desire versus a kind of broader kind of like political affinities with desires acting on you. With regards to, let's say, the last publication that I was talking about, Photopictorial. So you can see we know now that there was a connection with China, Communist China.
Right.
But the easiest way to stop that influence was in Indonesia, where Suharto basically said no Chinese publication coming in. So that's really the easiest way to stop it,
Yeah.
right? So it's not as though, so there are many different forces at work and trying to kind of mitigate one another. Basically, let's just put it that way.
Yeah, this is so interesting, especially for the Malaysian Chinese. We have the Ma Gong, right? The Malaysian, the left, so-called leftist leaning Malaysian Chinese, and also people like Lok Wen Tao, who are more for free China or Taiwan in terms of the choices and decisions. So indeed, that's not just institutional dichotomized, but also different layers of power network there. Yeah.
Lok Wen Tao was a major patron of salon photography.
Yeah, right. And also he himself being a photographer of birds, 鸟类摄影师, right? Okay, next question. 谢谢郭访郭晴柔, I think he's one of our PhD students too.
Okay.
Thank you for the speech. I'll just translate the Chinese question. Thank you for the speech. I would love to ask through J.F. Wang, Wang Jiefu, a lot of his work are all this, the scenery, the scenery or 采风风土 kind of work, and that's sort of his mode of success or his successful business model for success. In terms of that fact, can I understand the so-called salon photography in Southeast Asia could be understood as a kind of connection established for the purpose between these ethnic Chinese photographers and the local elites, whether they are colonial elites or post-war elites, that kind of, or 甚至进一步说, or to take a step further, can we say that photography, especially in this line of research, photography in Cold War Southeast Asia, part of the mission is a kind of ideological medium? Is that the main framework we understood that, or something else?
Let me. Thanks for the good question, because this allows me to kind of clarify, because I was trying to move through too many materials. I will narrate this in a very straightforward way, and I think it applies to all the salon photographers. Salon photography, let's go back 50 years or 100 years ago. In order for a photographer to know whether he was successful, whether he was considered artistic, he would have to participate in something like the format of salon photography. So it was the only way, because there was no school of photography. So it was the only way for him, because typically it was a male photographer. So it was the only way for him to test himself, to prove that he was an artistic photographer. So that's often the starting point of how a photographer became famous in the 1920s, in the 1930s, in the 1950s, in the 1960s. But when he became famous, he quickly would attach or attract the attention of the national elites. And the national elites, well, not just the national elites, the cultural elites and the political elites. So we are talking about different political affinities, the elites who are driving all these different political affinities. So very quickly, this photographer, made famous through salon photography, would attract their attention. And so in their political or social or cultural projects, they saw the opportunity to use them or use the praxis of photography, meaning the exhibition, meaning the contest, because the logic of the contest and the exhibition, the logic of the magazine is circulation. It means you bring ideas and images across borders, within borders and across borders. So for the elites, they saw the opportunity to make use of the praxis of photography to achieve their political or cultural or social projects. So that's actually how I would understand that. It's not to say that salon photography was just, because if you look at most of what now we call salon photography, almost 99% was apolitical work. Because that's why I say, when you look at, if you remember when I established a conceptual kind of like framework, I say that there is there are at least two layers of analysis. One is the photograph, and one is the praxis of photography. If you only look at the photographs, you will realize that salon photographers are producing very apolitical images. So there's actually there's nothing really more you can say about it. You can say, okay, this is a great image, this is not a great image, this is a beautiful image, but that's it. But if you look at the praxis, you look at how they experience, how they practice, how they were involved in all these different projects, then you realize that actually they were directly involved in all these political contestations. Whether they wanted to agree or disagree, whether they willingly collaborated or unwittingly collaborated, but they were involved. So that's the second dimension that I'm talking about, the praxis. So I hope I answered Guo Qingrou's question.
Guo Qingrou's question.
Yes.
Yeah, can I just quickly also comment a little bit about this? This is so interesting because, as you said, it's the politicalness of this salon photography lies precisely, sometimes precisely in its apoliticalness. You can say that， 就是它的看起来无政治，恰恰是它的高度政治的这个原因。Yeah, but how about? Can I just quickly ask, Ubin, how about realistic? Like for example, in Taiwan, that salon photography, of course, is coming from Lang Jingshan, right? Lang Jingshan, that line is of mainlander in Taiwan after 1949. But how that the left-leaning or left-wing or reportage photography came about in 1970s and 80s when like magazines such as 人间杂志 or other more like a realistic leaning photographers and reporters or writers began to take up photography as their weapon. But how about this? Is there sort of like a local trend or politically charged realism, photographic realism in that sense?
So there was always a concurrent. There was always a concurrent movement as well. So actually, the thing we must. So I have to also make clear. Even though I titled the talk called Salon Photography, right, you will realize that salon photography was only a factor very, very early in their career. Later on, all these photographers did something else, right? Some of them became documentary photographers, some of them became photojournalists, so there was always, so if you look at the example of Vietnam in Flames, right, you can see a good example. So you combine somebody who was an army photographer in Nguyen Ngoc Han, the other author that we didn't talk about, with this salon photographer together. So there was always a kind of like, so anyway, across Southeast Asia, there was always this documentary mode of working. Whether you can call it a radical mode of working, we have to discuss further. But there was always a realist movement as well. And actually, some of the salon photographers became members of that movement as well. Today we don't have the time because very often I also talk about the example of North Vietnam. So there was another guy that I focus on in North Vietnam who stayed on after the DRV was established. So he was established as a salon photographer, but when the Vietnamese communists took over the North, right, he became the propaganda photographer for them. Yeah, so they have multiple. So my intention here really is to kind of come back to their experience, and you realize that they actually have multiple roles, or at least their roles changed across historical time.
Right, this is like very inspiring. Okay, we have a next question also from our NYCU student, Bai Youcheng.
Okay.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. I have a question regarding Vietnam. A set of questions regarding Vietnam. The first question is, after the Geneva meeting conference or convention 1954, you mentioned Chen Fuli or Chan decided to move to Hong Kong. But are there other photographers moved to southern Vietnam? That's the first. And especially after 1975, when the North won over the South, where did some of these southern Vietnamese photographer end up? And the third is when did northern Vietnam, the photograph from northern Vietnam become visible afterwards? Yeah, I think this is like a set of questions regarding the historical junctures of Vietnam. Yeah.
Okay. Very, very quick answers, I think. Now, the photographers the first question, were there photographers that went to the south? There were a lot of photographers that, in fact, went to the south after 1954. One of them was Nguyen Mac Dan, the example that I mentioned. So there were plenty of photographers that went to the south. The second question, after 1975, the reunification, where did all these southern photographers go, right? So very simple. The more prominent ones or the more problematic ones were sent to re-education.
Oh,
so,
re-education.
Yes, I met Nguyen Van Thong before he passed. So he was someone that worked for the Republic of Vietnam Information Department. So he's the same, right? This guy was exactly the same. He was born in the North, participated in the art photography exhibition in 1952. I think 52 or 53. And then 54, after the takeover, he went to the South. Then he served because he was already famous. He was famous because he was a salon photographer. So he was invited, or you can say forced, by the Republic of Vietnam government to become the kind of information service photographer for them. Okay, so he worked for them. 1975, what happened? He was sent to re-education for 8 years. Then for him, he was quite lucky because he was released and recuperated into the. So I think he would have friends. He would still have friends higher up. So he was recuperated, and then he was able to find a career as a teacher of photography. So because in Vietnam, they organized the photographers were organized under the what we call VAPA, Vietnamese Association of Photographic Artists, or Vietnamese Association of Photographic Artists. Okay, I might forget the actual spelling, but we call VAPA. So this is the country, the state-run kind of like photo association, which actually has a lot of similarities to a salon photography club. So he was recuperated within that network. So he was in Saigon, later became Ho Chi Minh City. So he was a member of HOPA, Ho Chi Minh Photographic Association. And then he became a teacher. So he was recuperated after that. The rest of the people who were very, very problematic after re-education, so like the other photographer of Vietnam in Flames, Nguyen Ngoc Han, who was an army man, a photographer. So after re-education, they left as boat people. So some of them, of course, went to the States. So many of them are still in the States. Some of them have passed. So that's where they end up. Now, when was the time when North Vietnam photographs became visible again? This is not so easy a question to answer, because the question has, because you're talking about because first of all, what do you mean by North Vietnam photographs? That's one thing. Do you mean photographs taken in North Vietnam? Do you mean photographs taken by North Vietnamese photographers? Or do you mean photographs taken by photographers sympathetic towards the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, who could be based in the South? Because we know during the Indochina War, there were many people who were sympathetic towards the North, but based in the Mekong Delta in the South. Right? So do you mean that? Then, of course, there's the other issue of time. Because across periods of time, right, certain images that were politically incorrect were removed, even for the North. So for instance, when they had the Third Indochina War, which is sometimes called the Sino-Vietnamese War, 中越战争, which I don't think is a good translation. I think I prefer to call it the Third Indochina War, because it's not
中越战争, I guess.
Yeah, but that's not an accurate way of looking, because it's actually a regional, because you have to think about the Cambodian and Lao aspect of it as well. So during the, let's say during the after 1979, certain images of North Vietnam's connection with China, of course, those images would disappear. Right, naturally. Yeah. So
right.
it depends on the switch of political allegiance.
Glory IACS. In some sense, this is like the next question from Glory IACS. In some sense, it reminds me of Orientalism by Edward Said about how the West constructed the East, but in the sense is how Chinese descent constructed the indigenous people or native, such as Malay or Indonesian people through photography images. Do you have that similar idea too? Yeah, I think this is like what I have in mind, is that in what sense this so-called kind of, because in so-called European modernism, whether in literature or in sculpture and painting, we have this really well-known trope of primitivism within American and European modernism. 就原始主义，现代主义里面的原始主义。So that trend is very, well talked about or well known in the Western or European modernism. How do you talk about this? Yeah, that's also my question. Yeah.
And actually I'm not really saying anything new, because of course I use a lot of research by many other scholars. So I think you have someone like Karen Stressler, who was working, so visual anthropologist who was working in Indonesia, and she was, I think, one person that pointed out the factor of Chineseness in terms of creating a national imaginary in Indonesia. So that was, her work was or remains a very important reference point for my work. Of course, Edward Said's work is really important in relation to bringing in the idea of Orientalism. So I think on some sense, I would agree that in the sense that because many of the photographers active in the 50s and the 60s and 70s in Southeast Asia, many of them were actually ethnic Chinese. So to that extent, yes, the photographers were of a certain Chinese ethnicity, but how they define Chineseness was, of course, really up for grabs. It was not one Chineseness that they defined themselves of, right? So they have many different ways. Some of them would not really recognize themselves even as Chinese. So to that note, but if you want to say that they have Chinese ancestry, yes. So many of the photographers do have that. And yes, because many of the photographers were of that ethnicity, they were often tasked, or they often found themselves photographing, indigenous culture. In this case, because we are talking about salon photography. Now, salon photography, as I stated right at the start, had a certain kind of competitive culture built into it. It was a way for you to validate your skills as a photographer, to prove that you are a good photographer. So you would take photographs and you would submit to contests. And then if you win awards, that's how you validate yourselves. So in the particular case of Sarawak, they looked at the example of K.F. Wong, who was the #1 most famous salon photographer of Southeast Asia. And they saw that this guy, because he photographed so many of the indigenous people, he seemed to be able to make a name for himself. So apparently, I think people followed. And that's what I'm trying to argue, that they followed his template of going to the indigenous hinterland and photographing the people, and then circulating the images on Hong Kong periodicals. Now, having said that, right, I also want to caution a kind of classical approach, or not classical is not the right word. I want to caution against the approach of immediately then saying that the indigenous people are exploited. Because I reserve my judgment on that, because we have actually some information suggesting that well, I mean, I personally believe that if a photographer actually spent enough time on the ground, right, there would actually be a kind of collaboration between the photograph person and the photographer. So if you remember the graphic that I started that I put out right at the start, what I call the photographic encounter, right, between the photographer and the photograph person. I said that this is actually an experience. So if a photographer spends actually enough time with a photograph person, the photograph person has an experience and comes into a kind of collaboration with the photographer. So I don't want to immediately erase the agency of the photograph person, because I think it is wrong to think that the photograph person has no say in the photograph. Now, of course, if you are a photographer and you take a long camera lens and you're hiding behind a bush, and then you're like a peeping Tom photographing away, then of course we are not talking about encounter in any sense of the word. But if you're the photographer and you're in front of the photograph person and you're spending time, there would be an experience that both the photographer and the photograph person shared. So the photograph person will not have no say. So the challenge now is, how do you resurface the desires of all these photograph persons who remained mute in the photographs themselves? And I think I now have a sense of how I could do it, because it's about finding the resources and materials.
Yeah, yeah. Just like it kind of reminds me, because you the early history of film documentary. For example, there's a famous the early documentary about Alaskan, the 北方的南努克 in Chinese, or the Nanook of the North. That cinematographer also construct this. It's not a real camera work about the environment or the people there, indigenous people, but also there's a backstory also involves some kind of personal collaboration between the photographer, camera person, the director, and the local communities. But whether, I think we are stepping into a really gray zone of ambivalent 现场, or the ambivalent scene between the colonized and the colonizer, the photographer, the media, the photographer or the film director, and the people who are represented. So I think this is like open up a very interesting direction for like future inquiries. Especially, and also you mentioned, I want to throw in another related question. You mentioned the Standard Oil company, right? Somewhere in the Guo Shanghui's case, I think you mentioned the Standard Oil company.
Standard Vacuum Oil Company.
Yeah, the Standard Vacuum Oil Company become the sort of the patronage when they are sponsor some of the project, the filming project, or not filming, but shooting project of
competition. Also, they sponsor the competition.
The competition. In a way, it's interesting. It reminds me, because speaking of the early, what I know about, for example, the director of Nanook of the North, that film director was also contrasted by Shell, another big oil company. Shell company, to shoot a kind of indigenous environmental / company commercial short documentary film about Southern America, Southern United States, Louisiana, as like an early, and that piece of commercial work for the oil company also become one of the very first evidence of that environment, the Southern environment, of the native environment, what we now know about Louisiana or the American South. I think I do see some kind of echo between all these patronage or propaganda, either for political or for commercial reason, unwittingly, unintentionally become one of the earliest visual evidence of some kind of environment. Because there's no other. From what I know, there's very few or rare visual evidence as to what that natural environment or that indigenous environment we know, and that is oftentimes it's always in this, contrasted project that we get to see that environment. So the question come back to this, like, although they are politically charged or commercially charged, they still serve as a very good resources for us scholars right now to reconstruct that ambivalent scenario where these works were produced. So I kind of echo that power relation thing going on there. I think we have you want other question? You want to ask Zhongyi? You seem to have. We have questions
okay.
from our
Good
assistant here.
Hello.
老师，我这边可以。
OK。
但是老师，你帮我用中文问。
OK。
对，就是武斌，你不想要把这个不同的摄影做分类，所以就是从沙龙摄影到纪实摄影、战地摄影。那可是所以刚刚秦柔也有问类似，我有点是 follow 他的这个问题，就是他提到这个沙龙摄影的政治性，但是我就有点想要去再进一步问说，那是这些沙龙摄影的摄影本身产生政治性，还是这些有政经文化资源的人刚好他们会影响这个比如说他们自己的国家认同，他们自己的政治选择，他们的投资，这些在这个实质面上产生的影响，只是刚好这些人玩摄影，还是摄影本身产生了政治影响
You have to translate. I actually understand the question, but I think you have to translate for the rest of your audience.
Yeah, I guess I have to briefly translate the question. So is that you presented salon photography as a genre, but with this particular group of people who are oftentimes collaborating or in some sort of relationship with the political power. So my question, Zhongyi's question is being whether it is originally these people are already embedded in certain kind of political network they happen to shoot photos that makes this connection between genre and producer artist a thing, or that's the salon photography itself as an art form, as a genre, as practices carries that potential for being political. I think this is like a interesting causal relation there, whether that's the other one way or the other way around.
I actually think it's both. And the reason why I use the idea of circulation, is really because I think it's even if we don't think about salon photography, we just think about photography, any kind of photography, in order for photography to take effect or to have its power amplified, right? You need circulation. Circulation is one of the keywords that I always use to describe the power of photography. But it's precisely because it's so easy to circulate photography, and it's also because photography is so mobile. That's actually its power. And on the other hand, you have all these circulating political affinities, political forces, right? So these two things kind of like mash into one another. So I don't think it's it's not one before the other. I think it's just because that these two, let's say these two praxis, one is the praxis of political affinities, and one is the praxis of photography, right? Both of which require circulation. Because if you think about the praxis of political affinities, right, you also need circulation. Because let's say if you go to the standpoint of Singapore, let's say Malaya, 1952, right? What would be let's say an average person illiterate? What would be the kind of political affinities that he or she would come into contact? He will turn on the radio, maybe listen to Radio Fusion. Turn on the radio, look at the periodical, watch the movies, look at the magazine circulating from elsewhere, right? Then he will go to a political rally. So all these are circulation. So both of which require circulation, and I think because both of which depends on circulation, it meshes into one another quite easily. But when we come back to the topic of salon photography has this added, I think it has this added advantage, because we the problem for us is that we often study photography by looking at photographs. So when we look at photographs, we always think, well, this salon photography image is very apolitical. There's nothing, it's just beautiful, like beautiful landscape. So what does it do, right? So we kind of misrecognize its political, it is, well, not its political power, but its connection with, let's say, the praxis of the, political affinities on the other side.
Right. This is amazing, because I can add one point, is that to sort of following this line, this question is, salon photography also have to work for its power to work, has to work with that materiality of its form, such as you mentioned postcard.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that the media object of postcard, or you mentioned massive amount of circulation of journal, which is already another media object that's already in circulation. So in a sense, that power is not just through the content, also the aesthetic form itself, but also in collaboration with the material form. That, for example, salon photography is a kind of a souvenir or tourist object or touristy object sometimes that could become mobile. And it kind of, you can carry it across the borders to different places as a souvenir, as a journal, as some leisure reading or table books. It carries, I would love to use the word media affordance. It affords that possibility of different performances. I would say, like different actors perform through these photographic objects, if I may. Sorry, go on.
Let me just say one thing, because I don't want to give the impression that salon photography is a very small kind of like practice in photography. It was, you want to say that it was a very small kind of like exclusive club of people, you have to go back to that period of time, because salon photography was one of the most kind of like respectable hobby, for a kind of like person who wants to gradually go from the lower class to the lower middle class. It was one of the best respectable, healthy hobbies. So you shouldn't, so when we think about it as a praxis, we are also thinking about it in relation to not just making art photography, but making, participating in a hobby. But at the same time, many of these salon photographers, having started in salon photography, work for major, let's say major 画报, pictorial periodicals. So if you pick up 良友, you pick up 幸福, you pick up 今日世界, you pick up like 四海. And I know the research of Wang Meixiang in Taiwan, who is really right. The work that is also quite indicative, or who points me also in the right direction, which is like something like 四海. You see, actually, many of the photographers that work for them all started, or many of them had beginnings in salon photography.
Right.
That's how they tested themselves. Basically, the salon photography was for them to test themselves. Get a name.
This is so interesting, because you are pointed toward a middle brow. Instead of saying that these are elites for the genre, it's a kind of a really wide range of middle brow participation, middle brow possibility of becoming part of the middle brow or middle class, if you want. Sometimes
it's completely middle brow.
Yeah. So this is very interesting, because in Taiwan, I think from what I know in Taiwan, there's the long core period from some of the photography journals I collected was also filled with this call for submission, and especially highlight this point of being just a hobby or just a leisure time, 或者是一个休闲活动，一个中产阶级休闲活动，a middle class leisure hobby kind of feeling. So
but we also at the same time we have to be kind of careful, because at that point in time many of them were not middle class. They were aspiring to be middle class. They were still like they were still just arrived or trying to build a life for themselves.
Right. So I feel like there's a kind of discrepancy between what is presented in this call for submission discourse and the real situation, the participants of aspiring to be part of it, that kind of differences that you are cautious against. Yeah, this is very interesting. Can I just also ask one more, since we are doing this conference Zoom, or not Zoom, seminar talk lecture in Taiwan, I wonder, because from the picture you draw, the geopolitical mapping or the book market, what's the market for, since after 1949, the PRC sort of temporarily closed that, book marketplace. And then later you have Suharto, anti-Chinese influence thing. And there you have this like a Malaysian, the pan-Malaysian sentiment sometimes against Chinese influence. What about Taiwan? From what you know, can we find, because a lot of these in Hong Kong, right? And I know a lot of the book market, pirate book market, also channel from Hong Kong to Taiwan during the Cold War period. From what you know, what's the role of Taiwan here in terms of the circulation or mobility of these images and material objects?
To be honest, this is a subject I haven't actually thought about, and I hope somebody in Taiwan would do. I have no idea. The only thing I can say is I noticed two things. So if you look at the Hong Kong photo periodicals, right?
Yeah.
That were published across the years from 1950 onwards until the 1980s. The photo periodicals, which is magazines that focus on photography, focus on salon photography. I mean, they would, of course, feature Lang Ching-san, obviously, because he's the icon of Chinese photography. But beyond that, actually, you rarely see images coming out of Taiwan.
Huh.
You rarely. So now that we know, for instance, photo art and photo periodical, photo pictorial, the two magazines related to one another, right? And photo pictorial, which lasted for 41 years. Now that we know that it had some kind of like connection with mainland, so I'm not so sure. I don't know whether that's actually one potential reason that there would be relatively few images coming out of Taiwan that we could see. So that's one. I don't know what's exactly the situation, but based on my random conversations with some of the senior Taiwan photographers, it seems that it's not easy for them also to submit images outside of Taiwan. So they had to go through certain. So I think you have to be part of the 中国摄影学会. Then you might be, which is also a common way of organizing for actually Southeast Asia, because if you remember in the 50s, many of them were quite poor. So one of the services that they do in a club, which is they consolidate all the submissions and then they send it to, let's say, Hong Kong, and then they send it to US, and then they send it for France, and then they send it to Indonesia. So they actually, the clubs organize all the submissions because to save money, because an individual from Singapore to send to Hong Kong would be expensive. So they consolidate everything. So it could be that the traffic is not so clear. So I'm not, so in short, I'm not so sure of the situation. But the other thing that I also noticed was that I think Taiwan also tried to use the overseas Chinese kind of framing to organize some photo exhibitions, because I did see some catalogs from the 1960s in Hong Kong that were published out of Republic of China, calling like overseas Chinese photographers exhibition. And you see the same names, I think. You see the same names, people who are featured in Hong Kong from Southeast Asia, also featured in the, the competitions from Taiwan. So there was some attempt, but I don't know the details. So somebody has to.
That's wonderful, because I feel like this is like some kind of part of. I wonder if someone could connect some kind of activate some kind of links. Because from what I do in cinema study in Taiwan and Hong Kong, especially, there is always this KMT sponsor or Kuomintang sponsor, free intellectual or free artistic association behind some of the film festivals. And I wonder if that case could be extended to this secret or covert patronage by KMT or some so-called pro-free world Photography Association. Well, I don't know, but maybe I'll dig into. I'll let you know if I find anything. Yeah. Are there questions also from our other participant in the Zoom? Are there? You can virtually raise your hand. Joda, you have question? Do you have or other students of ours or others from the audience? Any question? Wow, this is okay. Just wait for a little bit. Even any question? You can virtually push the button. Virtually raise your hand. Anyone? Any others? Okay. I think what time is it? Okay. Wow. Okay. These are really long hours, and it feels not so long because I am so absorbed in your talk. And I want to thank on behalf of NYCU, or National Yangming Jiao Tong University, the Center of Cultural Studies, and the Institute of Social and Cultural Study, 社会文化研究所, where I'm teaching here, to thank Ubin again for this super hyper rich and intense and intensely researched and archival work and research work, and I learned a lot. Can some of us in as the panelists turn on your screen if you are still there, so that we can take a photo. Speaking of photo,
the most important.
Yeah.
The most important political gesture
in the Zoom, and just say hi. And many of those in the Zoom, in the Zoom virtual room, from my graduate seminar of media and environment, where we talk a lot about media theory. But I think your talk just showed a lot to us, many of us in the class, including myself as a teacher, that a lot of the issues of research topic actually came out from intensively looking into the materials and the network that connected by the materials themselves and different layers of network. And I think that word network and circulation are also two of the important keywords in our seminar, that we talk about a lot of different kinds of network, different kind of a circulation of material objects and human relation. And I think, thank you again for sort of demonstrating or masterly demonstrating how this could be done, like in really concrete sense. And I feel I'm still very excited about what you just said about many things. And can we take a good photo here just for the record, and also as for our gratefulness for your
by the way, can I thank the interpreter? I hope I didn't like make him very pissed off.
Yes.
He looks very pissed off. Did I speak too fast?
Okay, the interpreter, can you raise your hand? Yeah. Thank you, Counselor, for interpreting from English to Chinese for us. So I'll just count 3, 2, 1, then we take a group photo together. 3, 2, 1. Okay. All right. So I guess this is like really long hours, and people need to go for the weekend, and also there's some people for Thanksgiving for that sake. Okay, and I want, for the Western world. Anyway,
okay.
I want to thank you again. Can we just give a round of applause again for Dr. Zhuang Wubin for this really wonderful talk again.
Thank you.
And I really wish to, when this pandemic is sort of manageable, and when the border, speaking of travel and border, when the border is down or lower.
Hey, Singapore is open, man. You just have to ask Taiwan to open.
Oh, okay.
Singapore is open. We're waiting for you to come, man.
I know.
If you got 2 jabs of vaccine, you are welcome to come, man. Like, so you just ask your government to open.
Yeah, maybe I should just go to Singapore and talk.
Don't follow other countries want to have 0 case. Don't waste your time.
Right. Okay, yeah, perhaps, yeah. Or maybe I should just travel and take photos in Singapore myself. All right, and thank you for your talk, and I think this is a happy weekend for everyone. Thanks for my students and other audience for participating in this really nice seminar and lecture. And I wish to talk to you soon about many things, photography and beyond. Yeah, thank you, Ubin, again.
Thanks for hosting this. Thanks.
Yeah, and we will be in touch with you later regarding other logistics afterwards.
Okay,
yeah,
no problem. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yep. I'll leave.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Keep in touch. You can find me on
Keep in
Facebook
touch,
or
keep in
whatever.
touch,
Yeah.